Please, thank you for this unsolicited testimonial. And now, by special permission of the Commander-in-Chief, me, here is Mars' first space explorer, Colonel Cosmic.
I can't tell you how happy I am to see your smiling faces once more. First, let me say that this trip was made possible only by our dauntless chief, Og the Magnificent, introducer of Og Power, which runs most of our industry, and inventor of Og Speed, which doubles the original Og Power. A short time ago, the master was having trouble with the state limousine. He had, of course, developed the explosive charge. But it was inclined to get a little out of hand, just slightly. And, of course, there was always the problem of friction. Parts rubbing together, heating up, and causing all sorts of trouble. But our leader was undaunted. He immediately ordered our first expedition into space to bring back the secret of how other planets got their state limousines to run smoothly. The target was picked with painstaking scientific accuracy. Destination Earth. You all know with what eagerness I volunteered for the mission, and with what confidence I took off. I took careful bearings and set out for my goal. It seemed no time till I was approaching a country of Earth called, the United States of America. I set her down like a feather.
What's What's all the racket?
Naturally, I protected government property by making the saucer invisible.
They're after the chickens, Ma.
And though the natives showed great interest in me, I decided to make myself invisible too. Seeing moving lights in the
Okay. By the way, I put together those two documents,
Seeds
the
of destruction.
run of show documents for episodes 3 and 4, and I shared you guys on them. So the only things that are booked, I mean, the big
Seeds
segments are booked. So we
of
have the
destruction.
deep dive, and then
I'm going to talk about it, and what I'm going to talk about is that the show is in trouble, and we're a victim of success. Obviously, a lot of the comments obviously include normal people in the show. Yeah, that makes sense. And the rest of it was about my hair. Okay. And that's fine as far as it goes. It's lovely. It's great. You know, it's part of the show. But what people don't know is that it only has maybe 2 or 3 more episodes before it starts to fall down and it won't be this cool, fun thing anymore. And if we don't address that now, then, I mean, just like any proper economic analysis of our time, the seeds of the destruction of our show lie in its very popularity. I want you guys to take this seriously.
That was deep.
Love it.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte en los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo.
Live from Berlin, it's the Committee Program, the chronicle of the world's most mysterious global political strategic entity. On today's show, Monday, May the 10th, Ellie Mae O'Hagan, Vishnu Som, Stephen Kinser, Sylvia Colombo, Samuele Mazzolini, Alejandra Bernedo, Roberto Capocelli, puppeteer Liz Dapo, and featuring Deputy Director of Committee, our own Julia Doubleday. And now, a human of average height and who could easily be replaced by dozens of better prepared comrades but once met Gorbachev, our host and Director of Committee, Arun Chaudhary. Arun Chaudhary.
Oh, hey, Jacopo, thanks for the introduction, and thanks everybody for coming back for our sophomore effort. This is the hard part. The hard part is coming up with something that's exactly the same as what you did before, but different in all the ways that people want it to be different. And so we'll see how we do, the sophomore effort. What about that opening Petroleum Institute cartoon? This is good stuff, right? So it reminded me very much of this comic book that I received when I was a child in the late 70s, which is narrated by a nuclear energy guy, but it's about more of an all-over energy strategy too, talking about sort of nuclear and coal. And I think it's something that, like, look, the word propaganda we associate with kind of these big totalitarian, well-designed movements. But in fact, the term is from the Catholic Church. It's an Italian word and Latin word. And the kind of fight in our business as makers of propaganda is often whether or not the best techniques come from the corporate world or come from the government world. I think people are often saying, like, we harvest the best ideas from the marketing world and the advertising world, and we're going to use them for politics. And I think that in America, that's because we have so much of this kind of corporate propaganda. But this style of marketing and this style of everything actually originates. You know what? It actually originates. That was a revealing pajamas moment. What did you think? You think that's a lot for the audience? I would recommend this book, Selling the Great War, if you're interested in this kind of thing, by Alan Axelrod. And it's about the group of folks who were put together to push the World War I the U.S. entry into World War I and the marketing effort behind it. And actually, a lot of the techniques of mass marketing were pioneered in this effort. And a lot of the familiar faces who you see pop up in advertising and propaganda and public information theory again and again all come. I won't spoil it, actually. I won't spoil it now. But I think it's something everyone should check out. And tonight, we have a good show. We have a lot of things going on. We're going to learn a lot about Iran. We're going to learn a lot about Latin America. But first, we should get Ellie and Julie ready so we can get the first segment up, Cross Atlantic Crosstalk, and we'll have a special guest on that too. So thank you, Jacopo, as always. I hope you're enjoying your microphone. I think the audience certainly enjoyed your microphone, and I think I certainly enjoyed your microphone. And it's not going to take you that long to pay it off with the company. I think that probably 6-7 months, at least within the year, you're gonna like the way you look and the way you sound. All right, bless.
Okay, so good. Stay
Oh God!
What?
Oh dear sweet Lord!
Oh no, we need you alive. What's going on?
That is the last time that I am drinking sauerkraut juice. I guess we're probably not going to have them sponsor the show.
Oh,
I don't know. I thought I was in
not...
Germany. Maybe I would try something.
No.
It's exactly like sauerkraut.
Oh God.
You're the one who said I needed to be more hydrated, so I'm chalking this one up to you. Hey everybody, we are back, and welcome to another edition of Cross Atlantic Crosstalk. With us, as always, is the show's own Julia Doubleday, Deputy Director of Committee, and again, Ellie Mae O'Hagan, the Director of Class, a think tank in the UK. And we're going to talk about some of the issues that came up this week on what was a very quiet week on the non-stormy Atlantic, and then invite a special guest in, Vishnu Som from New Delhi Television, to talk a bit more about India, which we touched on last time. So look, there are some elections that are happening in the UK right now. Results are trickling in. I know for Scotland and for Wales, they aren't all in yet, etc. But for England, the results seem to be pretty clear. Can you walk us through what is happening on your happy island?
Well, it's been a catastrophic 24 hours for the Labour Party. Basically, I think that's the main thing. We had a by-election in Hartlepool, which I guess is it's described as a red wall seat. So I suppose I think I said this last week. If I was going to translate it to an American context, it might be somewhere like Wisconsin or maybe like smaller, but you know that kind of seat. And it has been Labour for 57 years. It was held twice when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, and it's sort of seen as Keir Starmer's first major test as leader of the Labour Party, and they lost it quite significantly to a candidate who lives 30 miles away from the constituency, who has lived in the Cayman Islands, which is kind of famous for being a tax haven. So it's not even as though they've lost it to a really great local candidate as well. So at the moment, really what you're seeing is just a lot of recriminations about that. And Labour also looks at the early declarations from the council elections, so that's like the kind of local government elections. Labour is also doing quite badly there so far, and there's been a few mayoral elections where it looks like Labour is going to have a tough time if it doesn't lose all of them. Sadiq Khan in London is probably going to be okay. And Joanne Anderson, who is the Labour mayoral candidate for Liverpool, is also probably going to be okay. But that one had to go into a runoff. And for Liverpool to go into a runoff is kind of like Portland going into a runoff with Republicans.
Right,
you know,
right.
it's like,
I don't know if that's a good
comparison. Yeah, exactly. The fact that it had to go into a runoff is worrying. So basically the headline takeaway is it's very bad for Labour.
I mean, the at the Red Wall in the north, they already lost so many votes with Labour leavers or with other folks unhappy with the party for whatever reason. Who are the folks that they're losing now, and where are they going?
They aren't going anywhere. They're sitting on their sofas. They are not voting. Once again, the best performing candidate in this election was nobody. The Nobody Party. They outperformed all of the other political parties. And I mean, it's too early really to sort of make like do a lot of sort of really detailed analysis. But I think from Hartlepool, it seems like the swing to the Tories was like, you know, a couple of, maybe like 1,000, 2,000 votes. The real problem was Labour voters not turning out. And I think really that is completely understandable because I cannot answer the question of why you should vote Labour right now. I'm a lifelong, Labour voter. I've been a Labour member for many, many years, nearly 10 years. And this was the least enthusiastic I've felt in my whole life about voting Labour. And I include Blair in that, you know. I did it out of kind of resentful habit, basically. And so if you're someone who isn't really politically engaged and, you know, you're tired and like you've got to go to work, why would you take time out of your day to go and stand in a queue to vote if you don't have a reason to, you know? And that's really, I think, to me is the biggest sort of takeaway. So from what I can see so far is that the Labour vote just didn't turn out.
I actually want to know one more thing, but Julia, don't let me like totally monopolize Ellie's time. Is there anything that you want to know coming out of this election and seeing these results? I do know that Keir Starmer says he's taking responsibility going into them for the results, but Julia, please.
Well, I mean, I think this gets at what you were talking about last week, which is that whereas Biden in the U.S. has acknowledged at this point, or the people around him understand that even though they were able by all sort of teaming up to defeat the Bernie Sanders movement in the presidential primary, that they still have to incorporate some aspects of progressivism into their administration, just because it was such a ultimately it was a narrow victory in the sense that they had to force a bunch of people to drop out, and it was a very large operation to sort of get him out of the running. So they understand that the left is sort of at their heels. We also additionally have all of these Justice Democrats coming into Congress. It seems like what's happened in the UK is, like, as you were saying last week, just a completely opposite, like, we just don't want you in the party at all, kind of like trying to just cleanse the party of any progressives. And I think at this point, there's just not room for just a centrist party to win, because ultimately centrist parties represent continuation of the status quo. And we're all just at this point, I mean, in 2021, after last year, after these just back-to-back climate disasters, people may not know the word neoliberalism, and they may not know about trade deals, they may not know about a lot of things, but they certainly know that the status quo isn't working. They know it's not working for them. They know that they're making less money than their parents were at their age, and that they can't afford homes. So I think this result, you know, really unsurprising, because as you were saying, Ellie, it's just, what are they offering at this point?
Yeah, and I think I guess, like, for an American audience, what's happened in the UK is, if you imagine that Bernie Sanders had won the nomination and became the Democratic candidate, and then basically was absolutely sort of, the one election he came much closer than people were expecting, but then at the next one that he was absolutely, like, defeated completely comprehensively. So you can imagine how the Democrats would react to that. And then if you imagine that off the back of that, you got someone like Joe Biden, or even maybe Starmer is more of a Buttigieg. And I mean, he's not really into tech, but you know what I mean? That's closer to his vibe than Biden. And then suddenly, like, he employed sort of all of Hillary Clinton's most aggressive advisors. Imagine how the American left would be now being treated if that had happened. You know, and that's what's happening to the British left. So I think, like, we're in a situation at the moment where the centre has all of the institutional power, but none of the ideas, because this era, like, exactly as you say, demands radicalism. It sort of demands left-wing answers. It just kind of does. And so, but they can't do that because that's beyond the pale for them. So they have no ideas, but they have lots of institutional power. And I think what you've got in the US is like the Democrats, the sort of moderate, centrist, whatever Democrats, wielding their institutional power, but allowing the left to sort of, come to them with ideas and sort of taking those ideas on. Whereas what we've got in Britain is like the left took the party away from us and they lost an election, and our priority now must never be like never allowing that to happen again, even if it means like destroying ourselves. That apparently seems to be what's going on, because you said, Arun, that like the statement is from Starmer, like I take responsibility.
Yeah, he's
for
carrying the
result.
bucket.
But what is like actually happening is that him and the people around him are saying, well, we always knew it was going to take a long time to recover from the 2019 election result. So this is part
Corbyn,
of us like
as it's
building
offensively
back.
being called on Twitter. I saw. Yeah, I don't like that.
Yeah, and also like so. But in order to sort of, if it was a recovery of the 2019 result, then Labour would have done badly but better, but they've actually done worse. So it's sort of going in, it can't be termed as a recovery, I think, by any metric, because it's getting worse.
But in Hartpool, is the worsening due to some extent to new players? Like, I think some of us observed the Northern Independence Party emerge online to then all of a sudden field a real candidate. Were there Labour protest votes going to the Northern Independence Party?
I think they got about 6% of the vote, which would have still, if that had all gone to Labour, that would have still been, and I think the Greens got about 1 or 2%. So then you're looking at 8 points. But I mean, and Labour still would have lost, but 8 points isn't nothing,
Does it show appetite for actually, I guess how existentially wounded is the potential for Labour due to other people attracting their levers? I think
we've got, I don't know how like common this phrase was in the US, but if there's Europeans watching it, they'll know it. The PASOKification is the phrase that we use to describe the decline of Europe's social democratic parties, and it takes its name from the Greek social democratic main party called PASOK. What we're seeing is a lot of Labour's sister parties in Europe, they're on like horrible figures. They're on like, some of them are on like 4%. These are like parties that would get like 30, 40%.
I think the Dutch Labour Party, the PvdA, is a very good example of somebody who just had that kind of election.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in this country, because we have a first past the post electoral system, there is like a floor for Labour, which I would say is about 25% maybe at its very worst, because it's very hard for new parties to break through. And I think that's maybe why you're not seeing as many protest votes as you might otherwise, because, people like me who like detest the Tory party I will always vote Labour out of sheer fear that like not doing that will get a Tory, means we'll get a Tory. And I think there'll always be like just enough of those people to mean that like there will always be like a decent floor for Labour. So, but I think, I sort of said this today a couple of times on social media, I think we are seeing like PASOKification, I hate saying that word, PASOKification of Labour insofar as it can happen in our electoral system. And I actually think if we had an electoral system like some of those European parties, like in the Netherlands, as you just mentioned, then I think Labour would be in serious trouble.
From some gloomy news to some better news, the cross-Atlantic crosstalk bump happened, and us just challenging the United States to think about IP differently has resulted in Joe Biden coming forth. I have absolutely no doubt that it was 100% because of us coming out in favor of dropping IP. Can you tell us a bit about this, Julia, and why it's exciting? And then also, once you do that, temper our excitement, because that's how it works around here.
Right. Well, so as we were discussing last week, some of the poorer countries in the World Trade Organization brought this proposal for a waiver to patent rights to the WTO. I think it was India and South Africa. And essentially, the votes on that waiver of patent protections for the intellectual property of the vaccine. So, in other words, the recipe to make the vaccines. Right now, it's secret and it's held by pharmaceutical companies. That vote split pretty much just along first world, third world sort of lines. So the US and Europe and Australia, Japan, all of the richer countries, Canada, that already have enough vaccines for their population, they voted no, do not suspend the IP rights. That will, create bad incentives, and then pharma won't want to come in and make more vaccines for us in the future. Every excuse in the book. And then all the poorer countries obviously voted that they wanted to pass the waiver. This week, I was quite surprised, delightedly surprised, as I think a lot of us were, to see that Biden's administration has decided that they're going to support the waiver. This is a really big announcement. It means that there's actually a really good chance that it could happen just because of the global influence the U.S. has. I will say, as I was mentioning,
to find out how much global influence Joe Biden has when it comes to something. But,
right.
Sorry,
so the other issue is that there are still quite a lot of countries opposing the waiver. So it's not just the U.S. That needs to get on board with this. It's also, we saw this morning that Germany, Angela Merkel was like, no, this is a bad idea. I don't know if any of the other rich countries have yet reversed their position, but we'll see what happens at the WTO. Is certainly a really promising, and it's a great first step. Even beyond that, though, obviously there's going to have to be more investment of resources. This is sort of like the bare minimum of what we can do is just give them the instructions to build the vaccine. We also need to likely help with infrastructure and resources in order to really get this thing off the ground. And of course, I just want to reiterate that this is something that is crucial for global public health. Every global public health expert is in favor of it. Without it, we're going to continue to see these more and more mutated forms of the virus that are continuing to spread all over the world. I think I saw this week that they found some of the Indian variants in the UK. So it's just really important that we treat this like we all live on the same planet, because we do.
I mean, but speaking of India, it's one of the places, and we have a guest coming on right now, but where actually just the recipe is all that's needed from the IP. Like there are already so many, very high production facilities that are geared towards putting out vaccines that are similar towards this. So bringing on our special guest from NGTV, Vishnu Som. Hi, thank you for joining us. And he is in India right now.
Hi there, Arun.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. Can you tell us a bit? I mean, we're just talking about the good news with this, but obviously the situation on the ground right now is extremely concerning. Can you tell us a bit about what's happening? And then we're going to start pushing you on the politics behind it, because that's something we don't get as much news about.
Well, Arun, I was just listening in on what you're saying, and before I come to your question, the entire patent issue is absolutely critical for India, a country which requires as many vaccinations as possible. But, I was speaking to Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw yesterday on my program, and she's the chairperson of Biocon. It's one of the largest Indian pharma companies. And the point that she makes, and in speaking to some of the other big Indian pharma companies, including the Serum Institute of India, what they have indicated to me is that, look, it's going to take at least 9 to 11 months after negotiations at the WTO are complete for generics to actually happen. And it's not so much a policy issue. It is about actually procuring raw materials and then transferring that knowledge and the infrastructure to companies which actually have the ability to manufacture and then to ensure quality. So we are fighting around the world against COVID, and it's a battle against time. And therefore, while this is a great initiative, and obviously everybody realizes the threat we presently face, it's not likely to happen in a very finite period of time. But briefly, to come to your situation on the ground in India, it is without any doubt the biggest threat that we have faced since our partition. The fact is that India is now averaging approximately 400,000 cases every single day, 4,000 deaths every single day, give or take a few hundred cases for the last several days. And this makes India, very much the world's hotspot. The health infrastructure in several parts of the country has entirely collapsed. Oxygen availability has entirely collapsed. Hospital bed availability has entirely collapsed. And I am sitting in Delhi right now talking to you in a city which has the finest, the best health infrastructure in India, and it's gone over here. It doesn't exist. If you want a bed, you aren't going to get it. If you want oxygen, good luck. And the big worry now is that it's going to Karnataka next, where the numbers, India's IT capital is Bengaluru. The numbers are staggering over there, and there's a real fear that it could go to Kolkata as well, in addition to some of the other southern cities. So that's the big worry, that this is now traveling all over the country, and the health infrastructure which exists is simply not capable of taking the load of patients.
I want to hand it over to Ellie to ask a question, but first, is there political problem, as we've seen the mismanagement from so many governments that sort of bear a similar shape to Narendra Modi's government? Is there a political problem in tackling this, or is it simply a resource issue, and once we get the resources high enough, everything else should snap into place?
So I don't think it's a political issue. I think it's gross mismanagement at various levels. And whether that stems from this government being in power or another government being in power, one doesn't know. But the fact of the matter is that at various levels, this has been mismanaged. I think the greatest example of the mismanagement is the fact that on the 4th of March, and again, this is something which, I've done in my own program, and we've discussed this with experts, leading data modelers and epidemiologists entrusted with the task of projecting a second wave in India on the 4th of March had actually said that, look, in a finite period of time, in other words, a couple of weeks, you'd have approximately 120,000 cases. At that stage, India was well under control. A few weeks prior to that, we didn't have this issue. But the government just sat there. The election commission allowed the elections to take place. The government went ahead with their leading politicians, the prime minister, the home minister, other political parties did the same, and they went and they canvassed, and they polled, and they polled. These were super spreader events. And the fact is, if you look at yesterday's statistics, in all of the states where there have been elections which have just ended now, there has been a very significant rise in COVID cases. So where is the accountability? There is one of the largest gatherings in humanity, the Kumbh Mela, where literally hundreds of thousands of devotees participate. But there is a mismatch between faith and science behind COVID. And in a situation like this, you have to go with science, and the science says you cannot be having this. Again, many people are likely to have contracted COVID there and traveled all across the country. So there's mismanagement at that level. There's mismanagement in terms of the vaccination policy, whether India in fact should have put in a lot more money into buying vaccines rather than exporting vaccines. So, one could go on, and perhaps the biggest example of mismanagement, two actually. Number one, the inability of the government to understand that a lockdown is the priority. You need to save lives first. And in as much as you want to save the economy, you have to save lives first. Because if you don't save lives, you don't save the economy. And we are well beyond the stage when that decision should have been taken. So what they're looking at now are containment zones in certain areas. You need to break an all-India transmission of this, particularly with mutant strains. And secondly, oxygen availability. How did you not know, on the basis of what one has seen in the United Kingdom, that people are gasping for breath, that hospitals are being overrun? Did you have your eyes open? Did you not know that it took the United Kingdom 3 months of a lockdown and an incredible vaccination program to actually get that situation under control? India is a large country. We have lots of problems. But I think the inability to understand that this was staring us at the face has been perhaps the biggest problem. So I won't use the word political. I would use the word mismanagement.
Yeah, no, that seems fair. I do want to open it up for others to be able to ask a question.
Shall I ask one? So in the UK, we had a second wave that was not on the same scale as India's, but it was pretty bad, and it resulted in the deaths of I think it's like 130,000 people now, and it was if you ask me, it was mainly a result of government decisions. And yet we can see from the elections that are happening today that the government is doing really, really well. So I was just curious as to your impressions of how this might affect Modi's popularity, what's happening at the moment.
Well, Modi has just lost an election in the state of West Bengal. I'm a Bengali. I'm from Kolkata, which is the capital of West Bengal. Um, and the juggernaut of the BJP, which appeared in many senses to be an overwhelming political force in India, has very much been stopped at the doorstep of Mamata Banerjee, who will be back as chief minister of the state of West Bengal. And uh, Bengal was a primary, or one of the primary political goals of Narendra Modi and the BJP. Now, it's difficult to say whether the handling of COVID had an impact because many phases of the election and the counting had actually of the voting had actually taken place before the surge, or it was happening when the surge wasn't as big a story. But the BJP has lost that election, number one. Number two, I'm not sure whether it's going to have a long-term impact on Narendra Modi just yet, because 2024 is when we have our national elections. Still, there is still a way to get there. It's important to remember that Modi is an immensely popular leader in this country. And a popularity beyond what many could even imagine would be comprehensible. But that's a reality. Whether this handling of COVID, the fact that we are seeing record numbers of death, will have a political impact in 2024, at this juncture, it's difficult to say.
Yeah. Go ahead, Julia.
Well, I was just sort of going to piggyback on that question and maybe dig a little deeper into Indian politics, just because before you got on, Ellie and I were discussing the sort of collapse of centrism. So the idea that around the world we're seeing insurgent, right-wing, fascist leaders who become wildly popular. And then to counterbalance that, we also have seen people with a more leftist vision rising to prominence, but in a lot of cases not being able to hold on to power the way the right wing can, because they are so shut out of institutions by centrists who are really afraid of drastic changes, especially on like an economic level. So something I've read about in India is I guess my question would be about the Congress party. My impression is Congress would be parallel to sort of the US Democrats or the UK Labour Party, in that Congress is the quote unquote further left party, but they're still, subscribers to a neoliberal economic system and the sort of development policies that we've seen over the last few decades. And because of that, they're maybe not having the kind of success they used to. So could you just tell us a little bit about what is happening in the Congress party right now? Is there an evolution happening in the party? Are they becoming more or less popular during this?
Opposition?
Yeah.
No, I think just to Julia, to take your question and to answer Arun specifically, the Congress isn't a viable option to the BJP or an alternative to the BJP at the national level. Yes, it is true that the Congress continues to be in power in a couple of states. The state of Punjab, for example, they're in a coalition in Maharashtra. There are other couple of states, Rajasthan, which is a very large state as well. But the fact of the matter is they're no longer as powerful a state as they used to be in the past. And while at the assembly level, at the level of states, they still do have a presence and are in power in a couple of states, Chhattisgarh, another one, for example, they are certainly not a national level threat in the manner in which they used to dominate Indian politics anymore. Even in the recent assembly elections, which have just gotten over a couple of days back, the Congress didn't feature anywhere in the state of West Bengal, which I spoke to you earlier on. In the state of Kerala, there's always been this, the left or the Congress and their allies coming back to power. On one election, it would be the left. On one election, it would be the Congress, the LDF and the UDF. The UDF being Congress, the LDF being left. But on this occasion, the LDF, the left, has come back for 2 consecutive terms. So, it's not switched around. So that's another indicator of the Congress being unable to sort of get power even in states where they've done well in the past. They are in an alliance in the state of Tamil Nadu next to Kerala, but they aren't the dominant force there by any means. They've lost very significantly in the state of Assam. The BJP was in power, they retained power, they did hope to actually regain Assam, but they haven't been able to do that. So, that said, it's not enough to suggest that at the level of states, the BJP is overwhelmingly dominant. There are important regional political parties, which at the level of assemblies would actually have a say. But whether these coalition parties would be able to come together during a national election and defeat the BJP, that's very much up in the air. And at the moment, there aren't any indications of that happening.
Sorry, Ellie, were you trying to jump in?
No, I was just thinking, is there not an unpopulated island that all the globally left-wing people can just move to? Could we look into that?
Well, the Congress doesn't believe it's left, it's just that we are in a phase in our country where we have an immensely popular right-wing government, which appears to be able to handle a lot of the allegations and a lot of what we in the media, in the few remaining independent media in India, can actually report and show truth to power. It doesn't affect them. That's a separate issue.
I want to give you the last word, Vishnu, on this. Can you also tell us what the aftermath of the protests that, even the progressive left in America, were able to see because of the scale and even despite some, I would say, very scant coverage, especially in Western press. But how that is affecting the situation now, and if you think that that is the seeds of whatever comes next as a viable opposition to the BJP.
If you're talking about the farmer protests have sort of ground to a halt as of day before yesterday. But the farmer protests are seeing a revival of sorts, with thousands of farmers coming towards Delhi and asserting their presence on the ground, which is exactly the wrong thing to do in a COVID scenario right now. But again, it's strange because our foreign minister just a couple of days back seemed to suggest that democracy sort of comes ahead of COVID, in India, and if this is an expression of democracy, then it certainly comes at a wrong time as well. So it's too broad a question, Arun, and I won't be able to sort of nail it down with any specific answer. But I think just linking to what our overall theme has broadly been, COVID, the presence of farmer protesters on the outskirts of Delhi now, after the protests had ground to a halt for several weeks, is deeply problematic, because this could easily be super spreader events. And I think there's one final point that I would like to very briefly mention, is that in as much as India faces a second wave now, a second surge in COVID now, the government is perhaps for the first time proactively saying that, look, it's not over. They aren't hiding the fact that there is going to be a third surge. And I think the big worry is this third surge associated with the so-called India double mutant? Because this variant of the coronavirus is extremely infectious, it's extremely transmissible, and it is spreading to parts of the country, and that's been now identified. Its characteristics are yet to be entirely defined. But the fact is, it does have some shared, characteristics as what we've seen with the B117 variant in the United Kingdom. But until there is more gene sequencing and epidemiological tests, we will not be in a position to actually know how much the vaccines work. And we will not be able to know how patients need to be treated or the prognosis on the onset of the disease. If this actually surges in the manner in which people believe it might, then India could actually be looking at something even more dangerous than what we are looking at now. Therefore, it all boils down to common sense. So all across the world, we need to mask up, maintain social distancing, and we need to vaccinate. India's absolute numbers in vaccination are still reasonably impressive. But as a percentage of the population that needs to be vaccinated, it's minuscule. And with vaccines now being in shortage in the pharmacy of the world, which is India, that remains deeply problematic.
Yeah, it's extremely scary. I hope we can check in with you in a few weeks and see how things are going, and continue to try to tell a story that's not. It's being told, but in a very familiar kind of patronizing global North versus South kind of way, and not as you're saying, as the world will not heal until, especially a place as big as India, gets over the hump, and so we are all in it together. Thank you so much, Vishnu, Julia, Ellie, and we'll see the two of you next week, and Vishnu, we'll talk soon.
I began to assimilate the material. I soon found out that though petroleum products are easily found anywhere, petroleum itself is a very elusive substance. Experts have to search for it constantly in all the most likely and unlikely places with all kinds of scientific devices. When they figure they found a good spot, they drill a hole in the ground called an oil well, for almost all oil lies far beneath the surface of the earth. These wells go down thousands of feet and cost a lot of money to drill. But that's no guarantee that they're going to find oil. Matter of fact, in exploratory drilling, only 1 well in 9 finds any oil at all. Only 1 in 44 recovers enough oil to pay for itself. And only 1 in almost 1,000 makes a major discovery. Pretty big odds. Yet America's proved reserves, the oil supplies still underground, have kept increasing steadily. I couldn't imagine how this ever-increasing supply of oil was achieved until I found out that there's not just 1, but thousands of oil companies, all competing with each other to discover and develop new sources of oil. For believe it or not, in the USA, anyone who is willing to risk it can drill for oil. But oil discovery is only part of the story. Once they get oil out of the ground, it has to be moved through pipelines, on ships, or in tank cars to fantastic processing plants called refineries. Crude oil goes in, and great Jupiter, the things that come out. Gasoline, for example, the most efficient mobile power source on Earth. That was the stuff that powered all those cars and trucks. And asphalt, which makes smooth, durable roads. It seems that oil not only runs cars, it even gives them something to run on.
Item 2. Yeah. Item 6. Small step, big win. Ecuador pivots towards common sense. Wait a minute, what? Okay, good. This is about the election. It's about abortion. Yeah, that is good. I was like, we don't like that guy. But yeah. Beautiful. We like abortion. Hey, welcome back, everybody, and welcome to your Global News Rodeo, which is a roundup of some events happening around the world as curated by our own Forrest Lovette. Item 1. Gracias, camarada. Prominent leader retires from Spanish politics. El Mundo is reporting that the left-wing Spanish politician Pablo Iglesias, the leader of Podemos, or United We Can, is retiring from politics after a gain of only 1.6 points in last week Madrid's regional election. He said, "I'm not going to be a plug. When you stop being useful, you have to know how to withdraw." One silver lining is Podemos now sits comfortably higher than the 5% cutoff for assembly entrance. With 7.2% support and 10 seats, Podemos will forge on despite the shocking exit of its leader. I would say shocking and unhelpful. Item 2, Klima Prima. Germany looks to climate neutrality. Deutsche Welle is reporting that German Finance Minister Olaf Scholz and Environmental Minister Svenja Schulz, both members of the center-left Social Democrats, have proposed legislation for making Germany climate neutral by 2045. This plan comes after Germany's Constitutional Court ruled the targets of 2019 climate protection law were unconstitutional. The proposal includes a cut of emissions by 65% by 2030, 88% by 2040, and achieving climate neutrality by 2045. Item 3, Colombia chaos. Tax bill spurs deadly revolt. We'll talk about this later, but violent protests have been raging in Colombia for over a week. Uprisings began on April 28th and were due to a widely unpopular tax reform bill, which has since been withdrawn. The Guardian reports that protests are also in response to the polarizing right-wing government for threatening human rights leaders and not providing an adequate social safety net during the coronavirus pandemic. The United Nations has condemned the deadly clashes with police and protesters, which has seen at least 18 people killed and 87 missing. Colombian Defense Minister Diego Molano claims police actions fell within the law. And we'll talk about this later, but Colombian right-wing police repression of movements, this is the thing that their neighbors look to them for. They are the experts when it comes to this kind of thing. Item 4, a Blockwork Orange. Facebook upholds Trump ban. Forrest, I like what you did there, Blockwork Orange. I like that. An internal oversight board has ruled that Facebook was justified in suspending President Trump after the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. NPR reports the main takeaway from the decision is that the company does not have to reinstate Trump's access to Facebook or Instagram immediately. The oversight board said in an announcement, given the seriousness of the violations and the ongoing risk of violence, Facebook was justified in suspending Mr. Trump's account. Trump responded to the ruling by saying, yeah, okay, nobody cares that much. Nobody cares what he said. I do hate living in a world where Facebook is deciding whether or not we get to care about what Donald Trump is saying. That's a problem for me. Item 5, welfare warfare. EU promises to help workers. Political Europe is reporting that at the Porto Social Summit in Portugal last Friday, senior EU leaders vowed to help workers overcome the hardships of the global pandemic. In a meeting on social welfare policy, the leaders also recognized the right to lifelong learning, meaning it would extend the right of universal education through adulthood all the way to retirement. Many member countries are resistant to the ambitious and, in their view, increasing power of EU institutions over social welfare policies, which are controlled by national capitals. I do want to dig in there just real quick and be like, I think the thing about the EU that people in Europe, it's that the EU has a lot of power for the fact that it's hard to mount a pressure campaign at Brussels. It's all the individual capitals that do it. And so the idea of a public pressure campaign continent-wide is something that people like me, practitioners working on the continent, are really trying to figure out how to do rather than just pressure all the individual capitals. That's the kind of landscape that makes working here very difficult. Item 6, small steps, big win. Ecuador pivots towards common sense. This country actually is in the show for the electoral reasons, but this is different. Al Jazeera reports that Ecuador's constitutional court has ruled that abortions in case of rape are no longer illegal. In the largely Catholic and conservative country, having an abortion can send a woman to prison for up to 3 years. The country's human rights ombudsman says there's an average of 6 abortions every day in Ecuador, and among those under the age of 14, 80% are the pregnancies due to sexual violence. The conservative and pro-abortion rights president-elect, Guillermo Lasso, says he has full respect of the court's decisions.
Regional conditions. Special regional information. Your local 36-hour forecast from the National Weather Service. Your local 36-hour forecast from the National Weather Service. Jaffa.
And though the natives showed great interest in me, I decided to make myself invisible too. Seeing moving lights in the
Okay. By the way, I put together those two documents,
Seeds
the
of destruction.
run of show documents for episodes 3 and 4, and I shared you guys on them. So the only things that are booked, I mean, the big
Seeds
segments are booked. So we
of
have the
destruction.
deep dive, and then we.
I'm going to talk about it, and what I'm going to talk about is that the show is in trouble, and we're a victim of success. Obviously, a lot of the comments obviously include normal people in the show. Yeah, that makes sense. And the rest of it was about my hair. Okay. And that's fine as far as it goes. It's lovely. It's great. You know, it's part of the show. But what people don't know is that it only has me.
Doom, doom, doom. Bam, bam, bam. Pa, bing, bing, bing. Pa, Roberto. Pa, I'm in Rome. Pa, where are you? Pa, chum, dum.
Hi, welcome back. So today on Deep Cuts, we have Stephen Kinser joining us. He is the author of All the Shah's Men, An American Coup and the Roots of Middle East Terror. The book is about Iranian Prime Minister Mossadegh and his overthrow in 1953, which was organized by U.S. and British intelligence under President Eisenhower and Winston Churchill. The coup came after a years-long battle between Mossadegh's government and the Anglo-Iranian oil company, now known as British Petroleum, to nationalize Iran's oil. This event led to the oppressive regime of the Shah, which ultimately then led to the 1979 Islamic Revolution and the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini. Today we're going to talk about the details of the 1953 coup, about how it came about, the players involved, and what the consequences have been of this drastic foreign policy decision, which resound to this day. So thank you so much for joining us, Stephen.
Always great to spread the word about this most important but not so widely understood historical episode.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I did not know about this coup until actually after college. So it's something that we're definitely not taught about in school, but it has so many ramifications.
And I want to give some credit to Bernie Sanders. I actually think the first person who said, you know, in the last 30 years said the word Mossadegh out loud to general American public would have to be Senator Sanders.
I almost fell off my chair when I heard Sanders say, Mohammed Mossadegh, Prime Minister of Iran. Nobody's ever heard of Mossadegh. It came on in his debate with Hillary Clinton, and then he went on from there. I tell you something, it was a shock to me. Mossadegh made it into the mainstream of American politics as he should have made it a long time before. So yes, I agree. I tip my hand to Bernie on that one. He must have been reading my book.
That's a good that's a good Bernie impression. We do a lot of those around
but
here.
I can do the voice.
You're in the running. So first I wanted to just talk a little bit about the background, how Mossadegh came to power. So can you tell us a little bit about what it was like on the ground? What was the Anglo-Iranian oil company, now British Petroleum? What were they doing? Why was what they were doing unfair? And how did Mossadegh start to get this really populist, gigantic following in the country?
The people of Iran had been struggling since their constitutional revolution right after 1900 to establish democracy. They hadn't really succeeded in consolidating a democracy. Then during the Second World War, Iran was occupied by Allied forces. But by the time the war ended, and after the Allies left, it was finally possible for Iranians to go back to their original constitution and pick up where they left off and try to consolidate a real democracy. From that process emerged this remarkable figure, Mohammed Mossadegh. He was already an elderly figure then. He came from very sophisticated background, and his father had been finance minister for many years. He was the first Iranian to have a doctorate in laws from a European university. He was probably the most educated Iranian of his generation. He became prime minister of Iran in 1951. Now, because he was the product of a democratic process, it was natural that he would have to respond to the will of the Iranian people. And the number one challenge, the overwhelming fact of life for Iranians at that time, had to do with oil. Iran is sitting on an ocean of oil. But all of that oil, when Mossadegh came to power, was owned by a British company, which was in turn owned by the British government. So all the standard of living that the British people enjoyed during the 1920s and 30s and 40s was based on oil from Iran. All the factories, the trucks and buses were run on Iranian oil. The Royal Navy, which projected British power around the world, was run 100% on oil from Iran. Meanwhile, the people of Iran were living in some of the most miserable conditions in the world. So it was natural that when you had a democratic leader, who turned out to be Mossadegh, that leader's number one overwhelming priority would be, we have to take back control of our great natural resource. We have to use the profits from the oil to develop our country, not send the oil to Britain. It was the decision of the Iranian parliament to nationalize the oil industry that set off the chain of events that led to Mossadegh's overthrow.
Yeah, I was actually, I was just so impressed at the very end of your book. You talk about going to Mossadegh's house and how you talked to some kids in the street and they knew who he was and they knew he had nationalized oil, which I think really speaks to just how much his legacy looms large for people. Because, I mean, for a kid to know that, just a random kid you meet on the street, I think that's really impressive.
Can I ask,
but yeah,
the folks who sort of supported this in the in the Iranian street, not actually on the streets protesting, but sort of was it a combination of the middle classes and the working classes? Was there sort of a consensus across Iranian society, or can you sort of play that out for us a little bit?
The vote in the Iranian parliament was unanimous in favor of nationalizing the oil. In fact, I'll tell you this little story. The prime minister before Mossadegh had been assassinated, so the parliament had to meet to choose a new prime minister, and all the eyes were on Mossadegh. He was the chairman of the oil committee. He had already been making speeches denouncing British control of Iranian oil, and as it seemed like he was going to be named as prime minister, he stood up and pulled a piece of paper out of his jacket pocket. This would be a great scene if they ever make a movie about this episode. And he essentially said, I will become prime minister, but under one condition. In my hand, I'm holding a proposal that will authorize the government to nationalize our oil resource. First, vote for this, and then make me prime minister. I will implement it.
I absolutely loved the amount of detail that you got into about Mossadegh's personality. He seems like he was such a showman and honestly kind of a drama queen. I mean, like, he continually announced he was quitting politics. He resigned as prime minister, like, and when he actually resigned, I believe over he was in a feud with the Shah over whether he could appoint the minister of war. Everyone basically poured out into the street and insisted that he be returned to power. So it worked out for him. But I love that he, not a compromiser, such a character. I would love to hear your thoughts on him.
Mossadegh was a fascinating character. You're absolutely right. And when I was writing my book, All the Shah's Men, I was effectively living with Mossadegh in a kind of a little room for a while. And I've had to write books about other people that are less pleasant. But Mossadegh really was a fascinating guy. So as I said, he was an elderly feudal landlord, highly sophisticated and educated, but he'd lived many years in Switzerland. And I think maybe he got a little carried away with the democracy of Switzerland. For example, when the CIA sent mobs out onto the streets to try to foment his overthrow, he didn't want to send counter mobs because he thought, as a head of state, you don't send mobs onto the street.
Right.
He, at the very peak of the coup moment, at the week of the coup, when the city of Tehran was in upheaval and turmoil. Leaders of the Communist Party came to him and said, "Give us guns and we will defend your constitutional government." His answer was, "If ever I agree to arm a political party, may God cut off my right arm." So he was very faithful to the forms of democracy. He was also extremely honest, which made him quite unique in the Iranian political pantheon. He was highly frugal. For example, when Kleenex came to Iran, he thought it was a waste that they were double ply, so he would peel them apart and use them one at a time. He also, you said he was theatrical. It's true, and he would sometimes work himself into such a fury when he was making his speeches denouncing the British and talking about what miserable suffering the Iranian people were going through. He would work himself into such emotion that he'd actually collapse on the floor of Parliament. Now, it was never really clear if these collapses were fully physical or if they were partly psychological or even kind of planned out in advance. In the West, this kind of emotional extreme was used to ridicule him. He was called the fainting fanatic. But in Iran, where the depth of genuine emotion is something that plays out in politics as well as in other areas of life, it gave him the air of one of these fundamentalist preachers who whips his flock while urging them on to greatness. And that's what Mossadegh was doing for Iran.
Well, so I want to go back a little bit to talk about right after Mossadegh decided, and the parliament voted to nationalize oil. Right away, the British had absolutely no intention of compromising at all with the Iranians. They just saw this as like a total violation of their legal rights to the oil. Can you talk a little bit about like what the strategies were initially that they were trying to employ to get Mossadegh to either come to the table or really just get things back to normal with them sort of owning the oil legally?
It's a very interesting story, and in All the Shah's Men, I try to take the threats and the different means that the British and the Americans tried to use step by step. So, as you said, as soon as the oil nationalization was passed in Parliament and made Iranian law, the British essentially kind of laughed it off. They were used to dealing with what they called the wogs, the peasants, the people out there in those faraway colonies, and they never took seriously the possibility that their position could be threatened. It never had occurred to them that they would not be in Iran forever and that they would not own the oil of Iran forever. It seemed like a permanent fact of life. So the act of Parliament was just nothing serious. The first British response when it seemed to be serious was to ask their ambassador in Tehran, how much money did Mossadegh would like to have wired to some Swiss bank account so he would forget this nationalization foolishness. And the ambassador wrote back, that policy is not going to work with Mossadegh for sure, even though it had worked many times for other Iranians and people in other countries where the British exercised their pernicious influence. So the British then embarked on a series of steps which they said were aimed at assuring their continued ownership of something that was their property. And preventing the Iranians from stealing something which the British owned by legal contract. That was the British approach. So the first thing the British did was to announce that the refinery, which they had built, it was the biggest refinery in the world, would be closed. Now, the British had promised in their original contract to train Iranian technicians to run the refinery, but they had never complied with that. So the British required all their technicians at the refinery to go home to Britain. Many wanted to stay, and Mossadegh offered them continued pay and benefits just like they'd been receiving before. But the British wanted to make that refinery stop working, so they required those people to go. They even put ads in newspapers in other countries that had oil industries warning oil experts not to go to Iran and help Iran extract oil because that would be participating in the theft of British property. The British then imposed a naval blockade around the Abadan refinery, just in case the Iranians would find some way to extract some oil and put it on a tanker. Then the British imposed what we would today call sanctions. They froze Iranian assets in British banks. They stopped exporting some vital goods, everything from concrete to tea. None of that worked. Then the British became really serious, and they started to come up with the idea that they would invade Iran. They would actually stage a military operation, either to overthrow Mossadegh or simply to capture the area where the oil fields and the refinery were. When President Truman heard about this in Washington, he went nuts. And he told the British that that's absolutely out of the question. You cannot be invading Iran. So then the British decided to take their case to the Security Council of the United Nations. And they wanted the UN to order Iran give back the oil company to its rightful owner, the British. To everybody's shock, Mossadegh in Tehran decided, I'm going to go to New York. I'm going to go to the UN myself. And he did. Now, this was the first time that the leader of a poor, resource-producing country had ever taken the world stage like this. This was before Castro, before Lumumba, before Nkrumah, before Sukarno. And Mossadegh carried with him not just the desire of the people of Iran to control their own oil, but the desire of people all over the developing world, new countries that were emerging in Asia and Africa, to control their own resources. And indeed, this was part of the reason why the West was so panicked at what Mossadegh was doing. It's bad enough to lose control of the oil in Iran, but it's even worse to set the example that countries everywhere that produce things that rich countries need can set their own prices and control their own resources. So the United Nations, for the first time in its young history, after hearing from Mossadegh, refused to approve a motion submitted by one of the Security Council permanent members, the British. They wouldn't order Mossadegh to give back the oil company. Then the British took Mossadegh to the World Court in The Hague. They asked the World Court to order Mossadegh to desist. The World Court also refused after hearing from Iranian lawyers. So this left the British in a kind of a panic. They were starting to realize that they could be losing their most valuable asset in the whole world, which is what that refinery was. Then they decided they had to overthrow Mossadegh. So what they did was they had secret agents who were posing as diplomats in Tehran bribe members of the Iranian parliament to prepare them to vote a no confidence measure, which you can do in any parliamentary democracy. But Tehran was a small town in those days, and news gets around fast. Mossadegh figured out what was happening, and he did the only thing that he could have done to protect himself, which was to close the British embassy and send home all the British diplomats, among them, of course, all the spies that had been bribing members of parliament. So now the British were naked. They had nothing in Tehran, and they were on the brink of this huge loss, which was unimaginable to them.
Yes,
and that is when they turned to the Americans.
Right. So this was something, there was a major shift in the middle of the book this is something I didn't know anything about. I definitely knew America was involved in the coup, but it was super interesting reading about the differences between Truman's foreign policy and Eisenhower. So Truman basically kept telling the British, like, look, this is your issue. Like, you got to come to the table. Sometimes he would send sort of middlemen to try to negotiate between the two parties. But again, neither of them were willing to compromise. And then when Eisenhower got elected, it was right away. I mean, before he was even in office, he had people who were coming into his administration calling up the British being like, yep, let's do this. Let's get him out. And this is where we have some of the most major players in the coup coming onto the scene, Kermit Roosevelt and the Dulles brothers. So tell us about Kermit and the Dulles brothers and how America sort of became actually central to the coup.
CIA was created in 1947. And he did use the CIA for covert action, but he drew the line at overthrowing governments. He wasn't going to go that far. and was explicit, not only in Iran, but also in Guatemala when there was an effort by the CIA to get his approval for overthrowing a government in Guatemala. He absolutely refused to do that. So the election of 1952, as you said, brought Dwight Eisenhower into the presidency. More important, it brought John Foster Dulles to the position of Secretary of State and his brother, Allen Dulles, to the position of CIA director. Now, these two had spent much of their career working at the legendary Wall Street law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. That wasn't a normal law firm, as you think of that term. It was a very specialized operation. And it was designed that the law firm had a specific goal, which was to defend the rights of American corporations working in foreign countries. So every major American corporation that had business abroad had Sullivan and Cromwell as their counsel. And John Foster Dulles was the managing partner for decades at Sullivan and Cromwell. So the defense of American corporate power was central to their ideology. And the only other thing that was that strong was anti-communism. So these made them particularly focused on Mossadegh. Both of them had actually been active in Iran and had had one of their major Sullivan and Cromwell engineering projects undermined and killed by Mossadegh and his National Front, who considered this to be an American imposition. So the Dulles brothers came into office gunning for Mossadegh. Actually, according to the last couple of biographies of Eisenhower, he didn't. He came into office without any particular feelings about Mossadegh one way or the other. But the Dulles brothers brought him around to the idea that Mossadegh was hugely dangerous and had to be overthrown. Now, how did this process begin? You mentioned quite correctly that the British were so excited at the prospect that they could get something going in Iran and finally get rid of what they called this madman Mossadegh, that they didn't even wait for Eisenhower to be inaugurated. They sent one of their top secret agents to Washington to try to persuade the new incoming group to reverse Truman's policy and agree to help overthrow Mossadegh. Now, this secret agent, Christopher Montague Woodhouse, who was formerly the head of the British Secret Service station in Tehran before Mossadegh closed the embassy, later wrote a memoir, and he devotes a few pages to this mission. And there, I'm going to paraphrase him. He says something like this: as I was flying across the Atlantic, I was thinking to myself, how am I going to propose to the Americans that they should overthrow Mossadegh? I realized that the argument we had been using was not going to work. That argument was, this crazy Mossadegh took away our oil company. Please overthrow him so we can have our oil company back. I realized that argument is not going to move the Americans. But knowing the mood in Washington, I decided that I wasn't even going to mention the word oil. I would say this has nothing to do with oil. We must overthrow Mossadegh because he is leading Iran toward communism. And that definitely worked. It was the argument that the Dulles brothers used with Eisenhower. And it's peculiar because Mossadegh, as I said, was an elderly feudal landlord who despised all Marxist and socialist ideas. And in fact, we have one moment when this coup proposal is working its way through the American clandestine bureaucracy, where we can see, due to declassified records, that there's a question raised. And the person who raises the question is Eisenhower, who says in one of these National Security Council meetings, first of all, he mutters, I wish there was some way we could get the people in these downtrodden countries to like us instead of hating us. Which, of course, I'm sure didn't sit well with Foster Dulles. But then he said something like, I'm glad to hear we're overthrowing this communist Mossadegh, but I didn't understand Mossadegh really is a communist. Because, of course, he was the opposite of a communist. And Dulles had a great answer. He said, well, of course, you're right. Mossadegh is not a communist. But Mossadegh is old. Mossadegh is sick. He could die. He could be overthrown. Iran has a lot of oil. It's right on the border with the Soviet Union. There's a communist party there. Put all these factors together, it's just too dangerous to let it fester. And that argument was able to win Eisenhower's approval, given the intensity of the moment. You cannot understand why this coup was carried out without understanding the Cold War context. And using that argument, we are going to prevent the Soviets from extending their power, would have won many hearts inside and outside the Eisenhower administration.
This is early on in the Cold War. I mean, can you describe what the Soviet bloc's relationship was towards these events? And, Mossadegh going to New York, he doesn't like them, but would he have any confidence that perhaps the Soviet Union would veto, just to get at the Americans? Or was there any kind of Cold War? Or are we actually seeing previews of kind of the non-aligned movement in Mossadegh?
It's very much the latter. So when Mossadegh was emerging in power, you had the same kind of movements going on everywhere from Laos and Burma and Indonesia to Ghana and the Congo and Guinea, all over the world. You had these new countries emerging. They had been either they had been colonies or they had been dominated by foreign powers. Finally, they were deciding that in the modern post-World War II world, they were going to establish themselves as independent. And they were so focused on developing their countries, which had been left so undeveloped by colonialism, that they didn't want to get involved in the Cold War. They kept saying they wanted to be neutralists. They weren't pro-Moscow, they weren't pro-Washington. This drove John Foster Dulles nuts. He hated neutralists. He actually thought they were worse than communists because he felt that actually they were, witting or unwitting, agents of international communism, pretending to be simply nationalist reformers, waiting for the moment when someone in Moscow would call them and say, today's the day, and then overnight they would turn their country into communism. So Mossadegh definitely was a precursor of the rise of the Third World and the desire of developing countries to control their own resources. That is a battle that dominated the Cold War. It's definitely still going on now. But it shows that during the Cold War, there were two ways of looking at the division of the world. The Europeans and the Russians and the Americans looked at it one way. They said the world is divided between the capitalist world led by Washington, and on the other side, there's the communist world led by Moscow. But in many parts of the world, that was not the division. The division they saw was, on one side, there's the Soviet Union, Europe, and America, all the exploitive European powers. And on the other side, there's the countries of Latin America, of Asia, of Africa, that are struggling against those oppressive powers. We were not able to see the world that way because we were so obsessed in seeing the danger in communism. And that's what led us to misjudge so many of these neutralist leaders who really only wanted what was best for their country, but because they were not pro-American in a global Cold War context, we took them as enemies. Mossadegh was the first, but not the last.
Sorry, I want to talk as we sort of move into the last little segment of the interview here, just about the coup itself. So let's say I'm Kermit Roosevelt. I want to overthrow Mossadegh. What does that look like? Like, how did he, as one man, with many former British agents in the country that he was working with, but what was the process of organizing first the unsuccessful coup, and then a couple of days later, actually doubling down and successfully ousting Mossadegh?
This is a really interesting story because it answers the question that you're asking. Essentially, you show up in a country, it's Monday morning, first thing, you get to the office, your job is to overthrow the government. So what do? What do you start with? What's your first project? And what's your second project? What do? Well, after writing All the Shah's Men, I began to think, I know so much about that now, maybe I could hire myself out as a consultant because I really understand how to do these things now. So Kermit Roosevelt really was a real-life James Bond. It's funny because when I was writing All the Shah's Men, I met his son. And he told me, it's so strange you say that because my father was a total klutz. He could not change a light bulb. The only thing he was able to do was play tennis. But other than that, he was hopeless. But somehow he, maybe it was the Roosevelt blood, had the flair for overthrowing governments. So what happened was Kermit Roosevelt arrived in Tehran. One of the first things that he did was begin bribing newspaper publishers and editors and columnists. Within a couple of weeks, he had the majority of the Tehran media on the CIA payroll. Every day there would be articles about Mossadegh being a Jew, a homosexual, a communist, a British agent. It was a constant barrage. In fact, there were so many articles, so much demand for these articles, that the CIA had to start writing some of them themselves because they couldn't even find enough Iranians to write all these articles. Then Kermit Roosevelt bribed religious leaders, mullahs, to denounce Mossadegh from the pulpit as an atheist or an enemy of Islam. He went out and bribed military officers and police units so that they would be ready on at the right moment. Then he decided that the way to strike the blow would be this. Mossadegh was involved in a struggle with the Shah. He had two great goals in his leadership. One was nationalism, which meant in Iran taking back control of the oil. The other was democracy, which meant in Iran that the elected prime minister should rule and the Shah, the king, should just be kind of a symbol of the nation like the king or queen of England. The Shah didn't like this idea. So there was constant conflict there. Kermit Roosevelt played on this. And with various efforts, he finally persuaded the timid Shah to agree to sign two royal orders called firmans. And these firmans authorized, or they gave a kind of legal patina to the coup. One was, Mossadegh, you're fired. The other was, I'm naming this other guy, this general that the CIA has chosen named Zahedi. He's going to be my new prime minister. So on the night of the coup, a few soldiers loyal to the Shah showed up at Mossadegh's house at midnight. They banged on the door, and the idea was, he's going to come down, we give him the royal order that says, you're fired. He will say, that's not possible, you can't fire me. We will then arrest him, and we will claim he's resisting authority. But it didn't work out that way. What happened was that Mossadegh had gotten wind of the coup plot, and he had loyal soldiers waiting in the darkness. And as soon as the coup plotters showed up, they were seized. So the people who had come to arrest Mossadegh were themselves arrested. The next day, the news came out, coup is foiled. The Shah fled the country, he flees to Iraq and then on to Rome, thinks he's never coming back. The coup has failed. And even at the CIA, there was a feeling that the coup probably had failed, and it was time for Kermit Roosevelt to come home. But he didn't do that. He felt he could still make this work. He still had weapons that he hadn't used. So here's what he did in those final days. The first thing he did was something that I might have thought of too. He hired a street gang full of toughs and violent men, and he told them, I want you to run through the streets. I want you to break shop windows, fire your guns into the mosques, beat up people on the street, and yell, we love Mossadegh and communism. But what he did even beyond that I wouldn't have thought of, is he hired a second mob to attack the first mob he had hired. So within a day or two, Tehran was totally consumed with street fighting and protesting. Gangs were fighting each other, not realizing that they were both in the pay of the CIA. And Mossadegh, with his commitment to democracy, refused to crack down fiercely on these demonstrations. And finally, at the end of that week, Kermit Roosevelt mobilized military units whose commanders he had bribed. They closed in on Mossadegh's house. There was a gun battle that went on for several hours. Several hundred people were killed. And on that night, Mossadegh was overthrown.
Yeah, I mean, it was really, it's such a shocking and
telling story, and you told it really well in your book. I did want to, before we get to the end of the interview, just briefly touch on some of the consequences later down the road. One of the things you just mentioned was that the Shah, after the first failed coup attempt, he got on his private plane and he ran away. I actually was surprised to learn what a nervous, kind of unsure character he was. He wasn't really behind it. He just sort of got eventually pushed into it by the CIA, and also his sister was very interested in this concept of overthrowing Mossadegh. But so he came back, and actually there was a funny anecdote in your book about when he heard that Mossadegh's government actually had fallen a couple days later, he yelled, "Oh, I knew they loved me!" He didn't seem to know that everyone had been paid to be a part of this. But so he comes back, and then eventually in the 1979 Islamic Revolution, he has to flee the country. The Shah is given safe passage to the U.S. And so in your book, the line you drew that I thought was super interesting was that right after that is when Americans are taken hostage in the embassy. And your point was that, Iranians remembered that in 1953, the Shah fled the country, and 2 days later, their democratic leader was overthrown and he came back. So their feeling was, if the Shah gets away and he's not here and he's not facing justice, it's likely the Americans are going to come and overthrow our government again, basically.
This is a really great object lesson that comes out of the story of the Mossadegh coup in 1953. That coup was a success. We got what we wanted. We overthrew a guy we didn't like, Mossadegh, and we replaced him with a guy, the Shah, who would do everything we said. So it seemed like the perfect outcome. And it would have been if only history stopped. But history doesn't stop. History keeps on happening. And the long-term effects of these interventions are often disastrous. If you want to prove that point, Iran is one of your best examples. So just take a brief look at how the effects of the 1953 coup spun out. As you said, after the CIA managed to overthrow Mossadegh, they brought the Shah back. He ruled with increasing repression for the next 25 years. That repression produced the explosion of the late 1970s, what we call the Islamic Revolution. That revolution brought to power a group of fanatically anti-American mullahs who have spent the last 40 years intensely and sometimes quite violently working against American interests all over the Middle East and all over the world. It was also the Islamic Revolution that set off the hostage crisis, as you referred to. So the hostage crisis was seen in the United States, and still, I think, is seen by many Americans, as examples of how uncivilized and how barbaric the Iranians are. By seizing an embassy, they broke every law of God and man, and they did it for no reason. They simply did it because they want to destroy. They're just hateful people. And so we didn't know any more at the time that would help us understand that episode. But since then, several of the hostage takers have written their own memoirs, and they all say the same thing. It wasn't nihilism or anti-Americanism that drove us to do this. It was something very specific. We remembered 1953. What happened then? The people of Iran threw the Shah out. He fled. But CIA agents working in the basement of the U.S. Embassy organized a coup, and they brought the Shah back, and the dictatorship continued. Now here we are in 1979. The Shah has been forced to flee again, the same Shah. Now he's going to the United States. We presume that CIA agents working in the basement of the U.S. Embassy are going to do the same thing they did last time. One of them wrote, we did this in order to prevent history from repeating itself. But Americans didn't see it that way because we didn't know about that first history. At the time of the hostage crisis, no one had any idea in the United States of what had happened in 1953. So the effects of that coup, however, didn't stop there. The overthrow of the Shah was one of those rare geopolitical events in the Cold War that terrified both sides. The Americans hated it, of course, because we lost our great pawn there, the Shah, but the Soviets also hated it. They saw this as a triumph of radical Islam. And of course, the Soviet Union was composed largely of these republics along the southern border, all Muslim dominated. So they were terrified at the idea of radical Islam coming into the Soviet Union. It was partly to prevent that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. That's what brought the United States into Afghanistan and brought us into that whole long mess which we're now trying to extricate ourselves from. And it still doesn't even end there. After the Shah was overthrown and Iran was in upheaval after the 1979 revolution, who should notice this but Iran's greatest longtime enemy, Saddam Hussein, in next door Iraq. He decided this is a great time to invade Iran. And that's what he did. In 1983, Iraq invaded, he invaded Iran. And then the United States decided we hate Iran so much that we're going to support Saddam Hussein. And the President of the United States sent an emissary to meet with Saddam Hussein. He went twice to ask Saddam Hussein, what can we do for you? How can we help you? That emissary was none other than Donald Rumsfeld, who later went on to become the mastermind of the Iraq invasion. So it was that moment that made us a partner of Saddam Hussein, brought us into that death embrace that spiraled down into the catastrophe of the invasion and everything that followed. So a lot of history came out of 3 weeks in the summer of 1953 Tehran.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why, that's why we wanted to have you on the show to tell us a little bit about this like insanely historically, just insanely historical few weeks in Iran. And again, before we go, the book is All the Shah's Men. We hope people will check it out and get to read in more detail about what happened. But it's just super important that we, especially us Americans, know about this history so we can understand current events in the Middle East that much better. So thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us. It was great.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida.
Another oil product is the diesel fuel, which runs giant trains across the nation. In winter, fuel oil made from petroleum brings warmth and comfort to millions of homes. And still other fuels help defend America's shores and skies. From refineries also come the lubricating oils and greases that keep the wheels turning in America. But that still isn't all. Crude oil, like everything else, is made up of billions of tiny molecules. And using the magic of research, oil companies compete with each other in taking the petroleum molecule apart and rearranging it into, well, you name it, fabrics, toothbrushes, tires, insecticides, cosmetics, weed killers, a whole galaxy of things to make a better life on Earth. And it isn't just oil companies that try to outdo each other, competing for the customer's dollar. The same story is true of almost every successful business enterprise in America. The result? A higher standard of living in the USA than in any other country on the whole planet. At last, the secret was mine. And now, to get proof of my discovery, smuggled past the border guards. In spite of my infinite precautions, one of them became suspicious and gave the alarm.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the committee program with myself, Arun Chaudhary. This is our sophomore attempt at the Smart Club section of the program, where we do a very deep dive with a panel of smart people on one issue. And today we're going to be talking about what has been called the pink wave, but we're putting a big question mark at the end because it does not seem to be a thing that's manifesting. And actually, it's just an invitation, I think, to us and to you, with the help of our guests, to actually have a more idiosyncratic view of what's happening. But let me actually read my prepared remarks. Latin America looms large in the United States political imagination as a landscape for cartoonish political extremes. Bearded Marxist guerrillas, sunglassed fascists, coups, tanks, and rarely any subtlety. From all sides, analysis can be told in very broad strokes, often to make the point the teller hopes to score. At the turn of the century, the emerging governments of Argentina, Venezuela, and Brazil were all on the path to rejecting neoliberalism, forming what was called the pink tide in the popular imagination of the left. And although this may have had mixed results, that is the basis for this pink wave that was predicted to start with the elections of the left-leaning governments in Ecuador. But as we will discuss, the surprising results there, as well as elsewhere, might point towards the need to take a more holistic look at an idiosyncratic and not too easily generalized part of the world. With us to give a fuller roundup of recent events in Latin America are Alejandra Bernedo, historian at Maine National University of San Marcos, editor and political activist; Sylvia Colombo, Latin American correspondent for Folla de Sao Paulo; and Samuele Mazzolini, research fellow in political science at the University of Calabria in Italy. Samuele, let me start with you. So, listen, we had these elections in Ecuador, and, Moreno of the PACE Alliance, who is the successor to Correa, who is the sitting president, was expected to win, was ahead by 10 points, and then somehow in the second round, the person who we refer to as the banker, from the Creating Opportunity Party, Guillermo Lasso, has slipped up the middle and is now the president-elect of Ecuador. So what happened?
Right, yeah. Well, thanks for having me in your program, first of all. Hi, everybody. So yes, this neoliberal conservative banker, Guillermo Lasso, won in the runoff of the presidential elections of Ecuador just a few weeks back. And he defeated the heir apparent designated by Rafael Correa, whose name is Andrés Arauz, who is a young progressive technocrat, who, as you say, was leading the race after the first round. And, the result in itself is quite stunning. Arauz was, he had almost 33% of the vote after the first round, and Lasso almost 20%. So, he was quite ahead. And Lasso managed to make an incredible leap forward to 52%. Why was that? We need to wonder on the motives behind it. I think the main reason for the outcome is that in Ecuador you got this widespread opposition to the figure of Correa. Correa elicits a big opposition in the country at large, even within the left. Think about this. In the first round, we had other two leftist candidates. The indigenous candidate, Yacu Perez, and Xhevat, who was a social democrat. Yacu Perez urged his supporters to spoil ballots, and it was a massively successful call. If you look at some parts of the Andean region, actually pretty much the whole Andean sector of Ecuador, the spoiled ballots actually exceed the actual votes for Arauz. And the other candidate, the Social Democratic candidate, he announced that he will vote for Guillermo Lasso outright. So the three leftist candidates in the first round sound more than 60%, but since they were totally divided in the name of rejection of Correa, you get this result in the runoff. Rafael Correa is this highly divisive figure. He ruled the country from 2007 till 2017. Many progressive social reforms that can be praised in the first few years, but then, especially starting from 2013, his rule, starts to be characterized by an increasingly authoritarian drift. So he's got this very narcissistic personality, which led him in the last few years in power to attack pretty much anybody even remotely questioning his politics, even social activists. There have been dozens of social activists jailed for protesting against his politics. So Arauz was in this very awkward position in the election, in the campaign. On the one hand, in order to have a stable platform of votes, he needed to be identified as a loyal successor of Correa, after the tragic change of mind of current President Lenín Moreno. But on the other, he needed to expand the electoral base by taking a distance from his mentor, and he tried to do it. He came out with a few statements, in which he sort of said, "Oh yes, there was some persecution. I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to do that. There have been some mistakes in the past." But in the end, he was kind of caught within this ambivalence, and eventually he was overwhelmed by it.
I have to say I'm sympathetic to that as a problem. Generally when you are trying to inhabit a it's Al Gore with Bill Clinton, it's lots of mainstream politicians you can think of who want to sort of embrace the legacy of their predecessor, but not entirely embrace it. Alejandra, I'd love to move to Peru because we're talking about successors and things like this. We have a very interesting case. And look, Peru is so exciting right now because it is what seems like to us a battle royale of ideology. You have Pedro Castillo, who is a Marxist, and then you have Keiko Fujimori, who is the daughter of Alberto, the strong man of Peru during the 90s. People my age, of course, remember him as the sort of, the perennial counterforce to the Shining Path when this was happening. Is there more to this than this sort of WWF wrestling super ideological fun match? What else is going on?
Yeah, as we know, Fujimori family is like a dynasty. Alberto Fujimori was president for 10 years in Peru, and he planned a system of bribery for staying in power for 30 years. And he raised her daughter, Keiko Fujimori, for be the next president, and now she's getting the legacy as far as he can. But Pedro Castillo, Marxist, yes, he got 90% of the votations. And Castillo said very convinced these words the first day that we knew that he won the first round. They said that only political scientists can rule the country. They had several years to do it. And what have they done for this country? In the biggest cities, they only see as far as the end of their noses. And now it's time for the people, the real people, not their torturers. As we know, Alberto Fujimori is in prison now, he's in jail, for several crimes against human rights. And Keiko Fujimori, she's charged with money laundering for being associated with drug trafficking. And she's always saying that in the 90s, with her father, we had a better country, and we need to return to these times. So I think that maybe even political scientists and journalists and lawyers at every election says that the leftist candidates are violent. And as with the Bernie Bros phenomenon, they say that leftist supporters are violent too. What we see now is how much far-right politicians wanted to militarize the cities. They were very violent in last November. They committed or tolerated crimes against human rights. And now we can see that how this is not as they told us. They always say that the system always worked, but if we can visit any city that is not Lima, or even in Lima, but in the periphery, you will see how poverty is always increasing. So now with pandemic, it's worse.
And do you see, just to follow up real quick, the kind of, for the electorate, is it another case of maybe the electorate sort of getting angry about a failed right-wing response to COVID? Or does this security issue, and is that why Keiko keeps hitting it so hard, still resonating with people? Like, where are the swing voters at?
Yes, well, Keiko Fujimori doesn't seem very worried about COVID-19 or anything because as we can see in far-right politicians, she said no more lockdowns, what we need is to work. And if a family lost any one of his members because of the COVID-19, we will give them $3,000. That has no sense, but sometimes people can think that maybe we can work, and I'm more afraid of the poverty than the virus. Pedro Castillo, he's very new in this kind of scenario because he was always with the workers, but he never said that he wanted to be president. So now he's trying to create a strategy for control the pandemic, but it is not so good. So there's a lot of fear because we don't know what we will do. In our case, the vaccination is very slow, and we had a big scandal here called Vacunagate, Vaccine-gate, and the former president, Martin Vizcarra, got a vaccine before any deal with Sinopharm. So He did it with a lot of politicians that were near from him. But we are waiting now for what they will say, because there's a lot of people like Mario Vargas Llosa, some political and cultural figures that are saying that it's better Keiko Fujimori because she will defend. She will be always in the right side, and the right side is the far right, because they will be taking care of the economy. But we see in the past 5 years maybe that how leftists, not just Pedro Castillo, but other leftists, were building a new speech about how the workers are the center of the country and not just the political scientists and the people who rule the country for many years.
Yeah. So when dealing with leftists, certainly Peru and other places, they look towards Colombia to get ideas and to get kind of tactics. Sylvia, can you tell us, it's less of a people-centered thing, and it's more of a people-centered thing and less of a politician-centered thing. But in Colombia, we have a very unpopular tax law, which would put an undue burden on working people and middle-class families, leading to widespread protests. We see a lot of stuff going on in Cali. Even though they've now rescinded that law, the protests are still going. What's going on there? And I would love for you to contrast, especially with Colombia's much different history with how they have dealt with popular movements, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. What Colombia is living these days is kind of a follow-up of what happened in 2019 when many people went out in the streets to ask for better access to health, education, and also to defend the peace process that was signed by the previous government, Juan Manuel Santos, and the FARC, the guerrillas, which has been in a war with the government for more than 50 years. What we have in Colombia right now is kind of the follow-up of this movements that started in 2019, and that also happened in other countries in South America, like Ecuador, like Chile, each one with some particularities, but more or less it was the same demand for more presence of the state in the social being in their lives, you know. And what we had in these few last years in many countries of South America, like Chile, like Ecuador, like Colombia, are some governments who are imposing some austerity measures, because there is not that many money that existed during the golden years or the first pink tide, if you want to call it. So Colombia is making some adjustments, and this tax reform was part of it. But what happens there now is that the president is pretty much unpopular. He couldn't implement the main issues of the peace process. And with the pandemics, all the social inequality and the economic problems of Colombia, they are more serious right now. They are more aggressive right now than before. And also they have a very violent police. The police in Colombia is controlled by the military, and they are pretty much aggressive. They don't have many patience with protests. So at first, last week, they were making this protest because of the tax reform, but the protest went so heavy, they killed 19 people, as far as we know, and they disappeared with more than 80 people. And right now, the protests are not only because of the tax reform, but also because of the violence of the state. So they are like scaling.
That's important to understand. Like people are responding to violence with violence, and that is causing. That is the fuel that's keeping this moving.
Yes. Yeah, and it's nationwide. Yeah, it started with some cities, some of the main cities like Bogota, Cali, Barranquilla, Medellin, and now it's kind of everywhere. And it's a mix of protest against the tax reform and protest because of the violence of the state.
I'm going to throw this to Samuele, but everyone should feel free to jump in on top or whatever. But when we look at a place like, and I'm going to say the B word now, Bolivia, the important addition becomes just on the surface. Of course, below, it's always there, but the United States. International pressure from industrialized nations. How do you see, is that what Bolivia can be a good example for us of, is what happens when that gets more overt? Or I think everyone here knows the broad strokes of what happened. Morales has policies that we don't particularly like, that aren't necessarily business friendly, and then all of a sudden there's problems in an election that doesn't even have many problems with, and then this new person. We've seen this movie before, but how did it play out, and how does that affect the conversation we're having?
Yeah, I mean, the United States they're always there. They're always just behind the corner looking at what happens in Latin America, always ready to intervene. Latin America is no longer a top priority for U.S. foreign policy. It hasn't been for the last maybe 20, 25 years. But still, when things get a little, too out of the way, there's still, they got a number of ways to intervene and to influence. They got their diplomacy, but it's financial diplomacy is also pretty effective. The IMF and the World Bank and so on and so forth. But also in the case of Bolivia, we had the Organization of the American States, led by Uruguayan Almagro, who played a key role in the coup/insurrection that took place 2 years ago when the results of the elections was invalidated and the military stepped in and kind of suggested to Morales that it was better for him to go. And then the government of Janine Áñez ensured. Of course, you got an economic war taking place in Venezuela. Massive boycott, kind of embargo similar to that Cuba has been experiencing for decades. Of course, the situation in Venezuela, the problems there, are exogenous, but also endogenous. It's got a lot to do with the regime of Maduro has been doing for the last 8 years or so. But I mean, yeah, it's always a presence to keep an eye on. I don't know if the others want to say something more about it. What do you think?
Yeah, because maybe it plays into the internal politics, not just the external pressures.
Well, you got the. Of course, I mean, I think the United States played a pretty. Of course, it was covered, but they played a key role in assisting the lawfare that has been waged in different countries in the last few years, through which former presidents have been accused of corruption or wrongdoing. Even though, I mean, the judiciary, the legal basis for accusing them were really tenuous. Were really little. There's a case of Lula, of course, who's just been freed of any charge. There's a case of Rafael Correa, who is in exile in Belgium. He cannot set foot in Ecuador. And his former vice president, Jorge Glass, is in prison. You had that in Argentina as well. They tried to accuse Cristina Kirchner. And of course, I think the U.S. have collaborated in this attempt to, have these former leaders behind bars, to discredit them. And the media, the local media, also played a key role in sort of orchestrating a campaign, through which the electorate was sold on the idea that who had governed their countries in the past few years were just corrupt buffoons who needed to be jailed right away. And I think that of course corruption, it has been there even during the progressive governments. I mean, it doesn't mean that they were totally exempt of it. It's something endemic. It's something that it's got to do with the culture, with the mentality that takes much longer to extirpate. But I think, of course, the cases of corruption were grossly exaggerated in order to attack those key figures that led, those popular progressive processes.
I would even say more than that. Corruption becomes so narrowly defined that it's only the theft of public funds, and it doesn't become all of the other things that are about state capture and corruption, etc. And speaking of all of that, and I'm just going to loop around to Sylvia on this, do you think that America sort of not being as aggressive as prosecuting the war on drugs has changed sort of our interests in places like Colombia and our interest in their elections altogether? It used to be something that was of the utmost importance. Who the Colombian defense minister was, as anyone every American with Netflix knows, will make a whole season of a television show for you. So unpack that for us.
Yeah, I think I agree with Samuel with the idea that the U.S. is not that interested in Latin America like it was in the Cold War days, or in the days they were financing the armies against the guerrillas in Central America, for example, or financing and helping coup d'etat like the one we had in Chile in 1973. And right now it's much more subtle. I'm not sure they are involved with with so-called lawfare cases. I don't think we have enough evidence to say that they were behind these corruption investigations that started. Many of them happened in Brazil with the Lava Jato and Odebrecht scandal. I don't know if they are involved in that. I don't have any evidence. But yes, they are involved in pretty much in what happened in Colombia in the last 20 years, when we see things like the Plan Colombia, which was a huge amount of money that was given to Colombian government in order to face the cartels, the drug traffickers, and not all of this money went to this fight. Nowadays, I mean, since Obama was the one who changed a bit this way of seeing Colombia and seeing the war on drugs. So he supported the peace process that Juan Manuel Santos was negotiating with the FARC, with the guerrilla. Since then, I think it changed a lot, the relationship between Colombia and the United States. Even though in the middle of the way, when we had the Trump administration in Washington, he was not very supportive of this peace treaty, and he was like trying to go back to Plan Colombia ways of dealing with the cartels. But right now, I think that it changed. And the peace process will be in the priorities of America. I don't know if it is between the priorities of Ivan Duque, the now president, but also he's not going to be the president for long. I guess no, because we have elections next year, and it's pretty much difficult that he can make a successor.
Alejandra, I think a very good parallel that I'd like to draw with us, especially talking about Bolivia and Peru, is the prevalence of the indigenous struggle inside and probably outside of these movements. And so when you have someone like Pedro Castillo, who may be extremely left economically and then sort of squishy when it comes to civic policies and it comes to human rights, where does that fall down with the Peruvian indigenous, who we know formed a very strong core in a lot of the rebellions and insurrection movements in the past?
Yes, he got the support, first of all, from Evo Morales. We are very, very related, yes, with Bolivia, and here always the far right will say that Bolivia is a bad example of progress because they're a country full of nationalism, and as we know, nationalism, it can be always a conservative or a far right politician or way of see the politics. But now in the case of Pedro Castillo, he's trying to respond these kind of attacks from far right politicians with powerful messages. Even he's very xenophobic with Venezuelans. But for example, in the last weeks, We had some billboards, big billboards in Lima that had messages like communism creates misery and poverty, or do you know casting a blank ballot helps communism, or earning more through my effort is being free. But as we see, indigenous movements always said that they tried to live in peace, but they were always killed by different big enterprises. And now they are trying to make these movements go through Pedro Castillo, who answered, for example, with a poem by Eduardo Galeano that said, "We are the nobodies, the children of nobody, the master of nothing, the nobodies who are worth less than the bullets that kill them." So it's very complex because all the politics in Peru are ruled in Lima. And in Lima, we never feel really what is happening in the other cities or in the rest of the territory. But I think that this era and the pandemic helped that a lot of people could use digital resources or social media to explain what they are trying to make from their cities and how they need to be listened. We listen always, journalists explaining that, yes, in other cities, indigenous people need to be heard, but now it's time. They are trying to say in it very clear. Now we want to be listened. You don't need to tell me that I'm not listened by anyone. I want to have a voice, and my voice is represented in this ballot that say that Pedro Castillo needs to be the next president.
So, we started out saying we didn't want to make broad generalizations, but it's now the part of the show where I really want to do that. So, something that Alejandra said just popped into my head, which is sort of maybe the hope is that social media, digital campaigning kind of would take things in a different direction. And what I think that different direction is as a campaigner is sort of the retooling of mass politics, which at least on the center left, and especially where I am now in Europe, you can see this just so easily when you go country by country, is that every center-left party is essentially become a professional party and not a mass leadership party, and has trouble getting people because that sense of community has faltered. It's not just even about the politics. Is what people wanted to see in a new pink tide, they were calling the pink wave, it is, I think, this community, or the sense of that there is a new mass movement. So my broad question is, who is representing, who is on the cusp of creating a new mass party? Is that happening in any of the places that we're talking about? Are the politics changing to sort of be more popular, as in working with the people, not as in, 90% approval rating? And what is the motion we see, in terms of the way the parties work, the way these center-left and left-wing parties are working?
I would somehow avoid broad generalization. I think it's difficult to relate what's happening in one country to the continent as a whole. I mean, we don't really have a homogeneous trend. We got more of a fragmented picture, really. So in Argentina and Bolivia, we got progressive governments, that are back in power, but they're more moderate than their predecessors. Venezuela is a totally, it's a case apart. In Peru, as we were just saying, you got a socialist Stalinist who seems to be on the brink of becoming the next president. In Uruguay, the center-right is back in power after long parentheses of center-left government. In Chile, God knows what's going to happen, with the Constituent Assembly elections in a few weeks. Well, having said that, I think that one of the deficits of the first pink tide of the years 2000, let's say, is that they came out, out of these, social street protests that had been taking place in the, 90s and early 2000s in different countries. So you had this social effervescence, and then you had a sort of vertical move, some movements, some parties trying to take advantage in a positive sense of the energy in order to, gain state power. But then when they became governments, and I mean, that's clearly the case in Ecuador, but also to an extent in Bolivia, of course, Brazil, this government somehow forgot about their origins, forgot about the social movements that created the very conditions that permitted them to reach power. So they somehow, just disregarded the horizontal axis of politics, just to use this academic jargon, which I think, though, it's pretty effective. It sort of hammers in the point. They forgot they totally disregarded, their demands. And they started to govern without listening to them anymore, without taking into account demands emerging from the population. And so now I think we are, depending on the country really, but I think in different places we are going to a situation in which we are having social effervescence again. Maybe creating the conditions for new leftist governments to take power in a few years. Hopefully, they will not forget about the social movements that pushed them to government. Let's look at what happened in Ecuador in October 2019. Look at what happened in Ecuador. The movement, the social protests didn't lead to a new leftist government, unfortunately. Look at what is happening in Colombia, what has been happening in Chile. I'm not so sure about the Brazilian case, really. Maybe Sylvia knows a bit more about it. But I think this, the new way of organizing, just coming back to your original question, the new way of understanding politics of these parties, I think they should heed the social movements a bit more and try to have the popular element. I think they become a little bit too technocratic, a little bit too detached from the real needs and sentiments of the population. And I think, if you want a leftist party to govern in strict accordance to what is going on below the surface, you need to maintain this connection more, stronger, more stable, more durable.
To listen and to harness anger, right? This is what a mass party has to do. It's so hard. Sylvia, do you have any reaction to that vis-a-vis things that are happening in Brazil, or even I think make a case for Argentina, kind of? Sorry, go ahead.
I think I agree with Samuel with the idea that we cannot generalize, and particularly right now where things are so pretty much disconnected in Latin America. We can see a wave, and what we used to call the pink tide or the red wave, or in the 2000s, were actually was pretty much connected with the good economic moment that Latin America was living, and that allowed these leaders, these different leaders, these leftist leaders, to give money to the people in simple words, through assistentialist programs and through other benefits. This money is gone. We don't have this boom of commodities as in that time. So I don't think we can have like the same phenomena happening in the whole Latin America. What worries me about this pretty much popular leaders that are in Latin America today is that they are actually right-wing leaders, just like Bolsonaro, just like Nayib Bukele.
This is the subtext of my question. Yeah.
Nayib Bukele in El Salvador that just did something incredibly authoritarian, like a coup d'etat, actually, by throwing all the judges from the Supreme Court. So maybe what we are going to see in the next few months or years is a lot of social uprising and tensions related to the problems that became deeper and more profound in Latin America. And the answer to that I don't know if it's going to be like the surging of a lot of leftist leaders. I don't see them actually. We saw some new left coming out from Ecuador with the Jacopo, for example. I think it was an alternative of something new. I don't know if it was for something good, but something new, like new kind of leadership. But I don't see it. In Brazil, the solution to fight Bolsonaro now is Lula, but it's almost 80 years old. Right. It's an old solution. So I don't see like a left wave coming back
anytime.
Yeah, I think we should be more worried with other things, with democracy, with the stabilization of our democracy, and don't let leaders like Bolsonaro, Nayib Bukele, Nicolas Maduro, Daniel Ortega just go through our democratic system. We should be worried about that more than if we would have a good leftist leader.
Right. It sort of feels better than it gets the results. Last question goes to Alejandra. Vis-a-vis what we're talking about here, and I think Sylvia's point about the surplus got spent and it ain't coming back is so important. What is it that brings structural change to a place like Peru? Is it, I mean, like, are folks, progressives, leftists barking up the right tree? Are they on the right path when they're looking for a political solution? Or is there deeper cultural, institutional, just what is it going to take? This election that's happening right now, as interesting as it is probably not the long-term solution for what is a peaceful and prosperous Peru.
Very difficult to say what we need now, because I agree totally with Samuel and Sylvia, because even in my country, different leftist movements say that they have priorities to solve, but some movements say that the priority is gay marriage and legalized abortions. And other movements or parties will say that labor rights are the center of what we need to change now. But if we can see and research our history, in the 60s and 70s in Peru, we had a very similar scenario, and what it led was to an authoritarian government, and then the shining path actions that we all know now what happened. And maybe now what we want is don't go to this kind of history or future. If we repeat what happened in 60s and 70s, it will be maybe a lesson that we never learned what we needed. And now what we always hear from the far right is we need to learn from our history. The history says that leftists are radicalized always like the shining path. What we are trying to do is not go too extremely, trying to listen and talk later and propose solutions. Yes, the first solutions are near or involve indigenous rights and culture protection. Obviously, labor rights, but maybe not some other topics that other movements in Latin America will do or will take as the most important or the center of their causes.
That's interesting. And so I think you're saying that you can also see the real danger in allowing the right to run to the left is essentially, to boil down, I think what you're saying. And I think we see that everywhere. And that's a danger when I turn on my television set in America and I see Tucker Carlson, going right from hating on immigrants to wondering why Google doesn't pay taxes, and seeing that it does seem like in a pandemic, the right wing has been good in adapting to a social democratic message. I think it's very dangerous. But thank all of you for coming on so much. I think we learned a lot. I think there's more to dig into. I would like to reach out to all of you, so we can dig in deeper on your respective expertise. And everyone else, thanks so much for watching the segment. And next week, I think Smart Club is going to be about self-determination, nationalism, and national liberation. Sticky terms that get thrown around like crazy. And we'll have someone in from Kosovo, from Catalan, and from Scotland to talk about it. Thanks so much. Ciao, Roberto.
Hey, Aaron, what's up?
Nothing. I mean, not nothing. Tons, with the show craziness. And I was actually just in Rome, and I called you, and I wasn't able to get a hold of you.
Yeah, sorry, I saw it. I couldn't pick it up. Yeah, I saw your call.
Huh? Yeah. Well, did you get a chance to see the show? It actually premiered while I was down there.
I did. Actually, pieces of it. I skimmed through it, and just a few pieces. Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
It was a bit long. What did you think?
Yeah, actually, since you mentioned it's a bit long, it's 3 hours and a half or 4 hours. Really? Do you want people to be 4 hours in front of the screen? I mean, it's good, eh? You're good, and it's interesting and people, but 4 hours in front of a screen. Well, what can they possibly say in 4 hours, right?
Maybe I can think the hope maybe people can come back and look things up later. You don't think that the people will do this?
4 hours in front of a screen? Is this a word you want to inhabit? I don't know. I mean, I know that there is this whole thing, let's go digital and it's cool and whatever, but I don't want to be 4 hours in front of a screen. There's nothing worth to be 4 hours in front of a screen, right? That's what I think, at least. I would cut it short.
I'm going to think about what you said.
Come back for the eggs, did you? Yeah.
And so, with the fond farewells of the natives ringing in my ears, I took off once again for Mars. My landing was a little bumpy, but I saved my precious cargo. Yes, I brought the secrets back with me, and here they are. The big secret is, of course, oil, which has brought a better life to all the people in the USA. But the key to making oil work for everybody is competition. Fellow Martians, I thank you.
Very interesting, Colonel. Oil, huh? Sounds splendid. But that, what was it? Competition. Not our kind of thing at all. Why, competition is downright unmartial.
Oil? You'll have oil for everybody. That's what we need. Oh boy, oil!
Look at them. You know what this means, Cosmic?
You bet I do, Og. It means that you're through. So why don't you get lost? Yes, the real secret is not only a great source of energy, but also the freedom to make it work for everybody. And if you have both of these things, any goal is possible. It's Destination Unlimited.
Hey, Liz. I'm not trying to get involved in your private life or anything, but I was going through your desk and I found these. Oh, Liz, don't you know birth control is abortion?
But it isn't abortion.
Look, Liz, your boss shouldn't have to pay for all those abortions.
Well, good talking to you.
Hello, Washington, D.C. This is your political machine. I'm out here on the street today to find out why people might support Muriel Bowser. Sir, what do you think of Muriel Bowser? No comment, no comment. I don't know where the money came from.
Look, folks, I'd love to marry you, even though it's 4:53 p.m. on a Friday and I really have somewhere to be. But the fact of the matter is I can't because of my religion. You know what I mean? Where would it all end up?
Keep marriage open for all happy couples across our great nation.
I told you nobody likes your monocle. It's ridiculous.
Everyone loves monocles. They can kiss my puppet ass.
Thank you, God bless you, and God bless the United States of the Uteri.
If you think this sounds crazy, how would you feel if it were going on in Maryland schools?
Visit marylandeducators.org/get-it-right to learn more. This computer seems to be broken.
Texas extremes past bullshit schemes make laws clinics can't abide. We fought in vain, now 6 remain. Access sure to be denied.
I'm sure they are lovely people, sir, but I'm afraid Michigan has taken the unusual step of requiring women to carry rape insurance.
I'm sorry.
What?
Yep. In Michigan, a new law requires women to get extra health insurance, just in case she gets raped and needs abortion care.
Just let me help you find the Cory Gardner tab.
There is no way I'm voting for Cory Gardner.
What? He loves the ladies. Said so himself a bunch of times.
But he'd make most forms of birth control illegal.
You seem kind of obsessed with sex, Liz. It's very unhealthy. Just vote for Cory. Come on.
Hello, everybody. You know, in all of my years of being a political machine, there's one thing that helps me find solace in all of the hectic noise of Washington. It's so easy being green, spending cash the color of the leaves, or maybe red or yellow.
Hey, yo, Liz, what are you up to?
I told you I was gonna go vote about 15 minutes ago at the office.
Right. I just wanted to make sure you were voting for Tom Tillis. I hear it's really good for the lady voters. Is there a special word for voters when they're ladies?
Hey, welcome back to the show. And what you were just seeing is actually videos that were made by our next guest, Elizabeth Dapo. All of these at the company I used to work at, Revolution Messaging, where we sort of got a reputation for making a lot of puppet videos. But in fact, the genius behind it all is Elizabeth Dapo, who's here with us today. And she's currently the artistic director of Puppet Co. and a friend of the show. So thank you so much for coming on, Elizabeth.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, this is the things that we say when we come on shows. We're doing it right.
We're doing it right. I think I've seen enough Good Morning America, so I think I've got this.
You're not just a craftsperson, you are also an academic. Can you actually just give us your background? Because when I start asking you some questions, I don't want people to think that I'm this huge, obnoxious person. You actually have the answers.
Sure. I've been a professional puppeteer since about 2010. I have my undergrad in acting and directing from Binghamton, but I got my graduate degree in puppetry and devised performance from the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama in London.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, which is super impressive and which I think probably steeps you in more of the background of this. And I would say, I think one of the things that we found so useful in using puppets is how much more human than human they can be when it comes to our ability to put empathy on them, but also our ability to accept them as somewhat two-dimensional. I mean, what do you think about the sort of interplay of what is special and different about a puppet theater versus the regular theater? And how does that play into satire?
Well, I think it's really interesting because I think, historically speaking, puppets have been able to get away with things that people haven't been able to get away with for centuries. Anytime that performances were halted or stopped because people were inciting riots or things were getting really interesting or testy in countries, puppets were still allowed to perform because their opinions were considered trivial. which meant that people weren't actually looking at them as instigators, but in all reality, they were the ones that were communicating some of these bigger political messages and these hierarching themes that were really pulsating through communities at the time. I think we can look at puppets sometimes. One of the big questions that puppeteers ask themselves when they're creating something is why puppets? So why do I use a puppet as opposed to putting a person in this place? And a big part of that is you can make these images of these famous, of these people. You can characterize them, you can satirize them, and then you have an object that speaks for them. And that is so unique and so special in itself, because suddenly, there's a Spitting Image in the UK went through its thing, and then it's coming back now, which is really interesting. But like Margaret Thatcher, they had a great Margaret Thatcher puppet that would bash the heads of people in the brain bashing. So like driving home those points, but you could do it with a puppet because a puppet is still an object. It's not a person going out and saying their opinion. So I think it's really fascinating in that regard that these, as you kind of put it, a two-dimensional object, this object takes on this whole new life and goes and can go in any direction.
But I do want to drill on this a little farther because there's something special here, because they're not cartoons in that, cartoon violence, Tom and Jerry, Itchy and Scratchy or whatever, it's not the same. I think we import more human value on puppet, maybe because of the physicality of it, maybe for some other reasons. But the tension that I saw in the work we did together was in thinking about, we have this really broad strokes thing. We can have Margaret Thatcher bashing someone over the head, this kind of thing, with that balanced with the advice that you would give me in my amateur, trying to pantomime along with you while we would do puppet things, which was smaller is bigger, subtlety is what reads in puppetry. This is the opposite of cartoons.
Yeah, it is. And
there's no straight faces.
I think part of it, as children, when we watch shows that are geared for children, we put ourselves into those puppets' positions. So the reason that you might love a beloved character is because you can see some part of yourself in it, or you ascribe that emotion to it. So if a puppet shows you that it's happy or sad, it really isn't smiling. It really isn't changing its expression. It changes its body language a little bit. But you as a child look at it and go, oh, I get this. I can read this emotion. And it's still a tangible thing. I think that's what's really important, is especially like with theater, it's something, it's not a screen, there's no distancing, you are there with that object live, which is really fascinating. And I think cartoons have taken some of their lead from some styles of puppet theater, because if you think about like more modern cartoons that do satire, like, the big ones that are out there, you can look back at puppetry and you can look back at Commedia dell'arte and you can see the origins of attacking things with satire. It's really an interesting, very long history that goes behind it.
Yeah, and especially when I'm thinking of things like the French Revolution and, sort of especially kind of things done with the masses where it's better to have something that's not written, etc. This is all after the printing press, but it still is more helpful. What do you think is the relationship between sort of ridicule as a tactic and puppetry, and even some of the work that we did together? Like, because this is something that maybe normally I'd counsel against when, if you can make fun of Donald Trump, don't ridicule his figure, speak towards his policy or something like that. But with the puppets, it somehow is a license to maybe play around with that more. I don't know. Like, it seems to be, I guess it matters which direction it's pointing, up towards the king or down towards the people. But please, go ahead.
Oh, it absolutely does. And it's puppetry has been used on both sides. Like you were saying, the French Revolution, there's actually a case where a puppeteer had little guillotined people, and as people were being guillotined in real life, right next to the stage was a puppeteer guillotining people along with it. And showing people, look how ridiculous this absolutely is that's happening. There were a lot of parlor style shows that were happening in the French Revolution too, where people would come in and do little tiny shows that couldn't be shut down because they were parlor, things. I think it's fascinating because both sides have used it. You know, the governments have used puppetry to get a message across or to stop a people from rising up, to try to crush down or push people down. But the majority of puppetry has been used for the underdog, the little guy, to get their message across, to really try and throw it back in the government's face. And we get away with a lot more because I think when it's an object, you know, there was a Trump puppet, a puppeteer named Brian Carson made a really great Trump puppet, and he was on Twitter the whole time. And he was a caricature of Donald Trump. So he had the big our little guy, you have him, it's so great. But you've got that, you know, you overemphasize certain physical characteristics, and you can get away with that more than if you had a person like, you know, when you have actors on Saturday Night Live doing it, then it's immediately called out. But if it's a puppet, we still have that gray area where we're okay with overemphasizing characteristics in puppetry that we're not okay with human people portraying. Fascinatingly, the Nazis took over some of there's a very famous puppet theater or puppet show called Punch and Judy. And Punch is this little guy who is spawned from Commedia, has deep roots coming from Italy, moving through. And Punch beats everybody up. Punch abuses his wife. Punch abuses his kid. He throws him off the stage at some point. Punch attacks a crocodile, and eventually Punch bests the devil. So Punch is supposed to represent the little man. He has a cousin in Germany, Casper. Mm-hmm. And during the Nazi occupation, it was decreed that all puppet shows would no longer portray Casper in a traditional way because he looked, quote, too Jewish. Mm-hmm. And the government went so far as to x-ray puppet heads to know the lineage of the puppet. Because if somebody had taken their head and resculpted a nose, then they would say this puppet is too Jewish, you can't use it. And that's, you know, on one side of the coin, that's how puppetry was used against people. But then on the other side, right across the pond, Mr. Punch was dressed up as Winston Churchill and beating up Hitler. So the same character just twisted for different purposes. And I think it's all a matter of what is happening at the moment in time.
We put a lot on these little guys. You know what I mean? It's a lot for a puppet to bear in this world. Is there a difference? You know, we're talking about a lot of traditions probably coming out of the Renaissance, other things, you know, it's Europe. In Asia and shadow puppets, this is more of an elite tradition. And so do you see more of that top-downness maybe in the stories that are told coming out of that tradition? Or is that anything that makes sense to you?
Yeah, so you have it both ways again. You have, even though it was, you know, it's considered an elite tradition, it still means it's for every person to enjoy. So there are different points of history, especially in China, where puppets were not only used to propagate what was being decreed, what was being said, but also on the lower tiers of society, it was being used to tell the fairy tales that were no longer being able to be told, to tell the stories and the folk heroes, because it still inspired people to rise up. And puppets were allowed to do it when people weren't allowed to do it. So you had shadow puppets and you had all these beautiful different styles, and they could still perform because it was considered high art still, but they weren't being censored nearly as often as acting troupes were. And you see that not only like European countries. America is relatively, you know, I've tried to find more and more history about before colonization, what were the early American indigenous peoples, what was their version of a puppet, because every culture has
a representative kind of object. Yeah.
Right. So like the Hopi, the little Zunis, they can also be considered a style of puppet because they're representative of a god, you know, in that little form. It's just once like American puppetry really kicked off in the 1920s. And I'm also trying to, one of my current research ideas is to try to find more information about how, if enslaved people in the early part of the United States, how were they using puppets? Was puppetry something that came over from the African culture, and how was it part of the South? It's very hard to find anything about this. It's hard to find if there's any information anywhere, but I can't imagine it wasn't there somehow.
Yeah.
It's all fascinating, but every culture in the world has that instance of either somebody's pushing them down and puppets are there to push back.
I mean, fast forward though, because I would love to hear more about America in the parts that unfortunately we do have more information about. But, I think about the 60s, the 1960s, and kind of, the ideas like Bread and Puppets, I think is in Vermont, right? Or these kind of
Bread and Puppet is like the quintessential political puppet movement in the United States.
Does that come out of like American vaudeville and stuff, or is there sort of a unique like puppet tradition that you see starting as a folk tradition in America, probably in the 1800s sometime?
I think, honestly, Bread and Puppet is sort of a unique creature, but it of course has all its roots throughout American puppetry. In Appalachia, in West Virginia, there is a whole troupe of puppeteers that were just up in the mountains that were telling these stories, and they had a huge folk influence. Using a stylized American music with puppets, with a very unique style of American puppets. Bread and Puppet, brainchild of one man who basically was like, hey, we're going to do this thing. But in Chile, in Peru, in different parts of Africa, these huge effigies have always been used to represent people that maybe were not the most popular humans, like Mexico. I was just reading something the other day about Frida Kahlo, who brought back this Judas Day, where they would make these massive puppets that were effigies of Judas. But what they would do is decorate them to look like local officials that they didn't like, or police constables that they were not fans of, and then they would they'd parade them through town and light them on fire. And it got banned for years and years and years, and then basically Frida Kahlo brought it back. So these beautiful traditions all play into, and it's really hard not to think that everything that's happening culturally, artistically, on stage, in music, in visual art, doesn't have an influence on every other art form that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're looking at like German Expressionism, then you can see how it has influences on the puppet style at the time. Or if you're looking at a certain type of music that overtook a generation, you can see that in the puppetry being developed. Like you can almost hear it in certain puppeteers in how they worked and how they made stuff. So I think everything feeds into everything else, but it always has something to do with, where's the world at the moment? The 60s and 70s, Vietnam in the United States, this really hard cultural clash happening, and then these giant puppets showing up, and they hand out bread, homemade bread, when you go to a performance and you get bread and you get theater and you get brought into this great fold of people. And they do really hard-hitting political stuff. And then sometimes it's just really like, oh, butterflies in a field. This is great. So we have to really dive in and look at what's happening around us sometimes. I don't know if you know Theater for a New City in New York.
Mm-mm.
They do a great... Crystal is the lady, and of course I'm blanking on her last name, but she has done this tour of parks in New York City where she takes this show out that she writes every year, and every year it's highly political, and every year it has puppets in it. So in New York City, it's still happening. The last time that I was up there, she was doing this show about how shit she thought the last administration was, and she was very vocal about taking it to public parks, and anybody could come see it. And that's kind of the beauty of it, is anybody can come see it. It's open for anybody. You don't have to pay a ton of money. It's not like going to the opera where you can feel out of place, even though you shouldn't. It's not like having an exclusive ticket to something. Puppets basically open access to everybody. Okay, I've ranted.
No, it's so true. It's so nice. And I think it's one of the reasons that we, found so much use for them. But now let's put on your craft hat, take off the academic hat, and let's talk about our relationship basically, which is like I present you with a problem. We are creating a splash page to show off our new digital smart capabilities. So what we really need from you is gritty. The Philadelphia hockey team. We have some Europeans on here, so I'm not gonna know who Gritty is. But Gritty,
I love it.
So he's a mascot for a hockey team. He's a nihilist. He has sort of a reputation. He's great, and he's running for president. And so we give you that, and you give us this. Here he is. So just walk me through what happened. I tell you that we need Gritty, but he needs to be running for office. And so you get to work. So talk to me.
So your projects were always really interesting because you'd say, "Hey, it's Friday, and I would if we could have this by next Tuesday, that'd be great." And I would go, "Yes, absolutely, yes. Like, let's try to figure this out." So what I do first is I go, "Gritty, okay, great. Let's find all the information I can find on Gritty. Who is Gritty? What does he look like? But also, what is he currently standing for with who he is?" When Gritty first came out, he was not well received by the public. Everybody was like, "What is this abomination?
Yeah.
Bring back our beloved, we don't want this." But then Gritty slowly took on this punk rock subculture feel of anything happening was because Gritty said
the
so.
Underdog of the underdog who always wins. Yeah.
Yes, and that's the thing is he got so big, and then during the most recent election, there were so many Gritty memes, and he's definitely used by this. I won't even say it's left; it's more progressive, but it's like this progressive punk movement that's happening. Anarchists love Gritty. They're everywhere on Facebook is Gritty. So I look at all of how is Gritty being used, and then I go, okay, great. I know what context he exists in here. How do I make him exist in this world that he wouldn't normally exist in? He's running for a public office.
Yeah.
So we get he's got a nice suit on, and then I just start building. And I will say, I have learned so much by you telling me giving me these tight deadlines, but also giving me this fantastic motivation, because it encouraged me as an artist to keep pushing and growing and pushing and growing. And the thing is now, I have come so far the last 3 years in terms of being a builder, because I learned so much from having to play on the fly. When we did Eunice.
Yes.
Eunice was a 6-hour turnaround. So you told me I need a uterus
you will
that
have
talks.
seen in the video, she is the uterus who represents Abortion AF, which is a reproductive rights group out of Brooklyn, New York.
Woo!
Which I'm
but we had 6 hours, and it's what the timeline I had, because I was like, finish this job, make puppet, give puppet. That's the timeline I have. So I sat down with a huge iced tea, as I'm prone to do, with lots of caffeine. And I went, okay, here's my Google search history is great. Because it's what's uterus? Everything. I have looked for everything. So my first step is research. And then I got to ask, why are we using a puppet? What does the puppet need to be able to do that, a human can't do? And obviously, an object is something fantastic. An organ can't speak for itself. So let's make it the mouthpiece for this great, movement. And then I just start playing around with materials. Is this going to work? Is this going to work? And as I have found out, sometimes the best ideas are not your first ideas, your second ideas, or your third ideas. When we made our two little marionette guys, we went through a process there because I really
they were the Koch brothers,
wanted to.
Dear viewer, it's just so that you know. Yeah, and they are.
Yes, they were.
I have them around someplace. They are just the creepiest.
They're really creepy. They are on my rebuild list because I want to make more. They're too uncanny valley, which is something you'll hear puppeteers and people will say with AI. Is the uncanny valley is if we mimic too close to what humans actually look like, people don't want to see it.
Totally.
So you have a very fine balance to walk when you're designing something of caricature versus hyperrealism. These guys were a little too hyperreal. They had teeth. It was a little much. But you kind of, you figure that out, and then you just play with materials and you see what sticks and you see what doesn't, and you learn from that process, so that the next time around when you're doing, if you're saying, hey, I need another puppet, it's going to be this style, you have the basis set up and you can keep going forward.
And for anyone who's
it's a lot of fun.
Anyone who thinks this isn't absolutely literally true, not that long after Eunice, we were working for a heart group, and we had to then make a talking heart, which actually came out really good.
Cora, yep.
Who was going to be the spokeswoman for the Women's Heart Alliance, yeah.
So it's and it's a challenge, but also at the same time, it's so much fun, and getting to do what I consider a one-off project where we made Gary and Jill, we did it. We made them. They're out there in the world. It's fantastic, as opposed to designing an entire show, which is a whole different beast. That requires a lot of time, a lot of research, and then usually you're building maybe 10 to 20 puppets. The biggest build I ever did was a 40 puppet show,
That seems like a lot.
which was insanity. I don't recommend it for the amount of time and money that I had behind the project. Don't recommend it.
Now just have them change clothes, you know what I mean? You need more outfit changes and fewer puppets.
That show was really fun. It was Cannibal the Musical, the Trey Parker and Matt Stone show. And one of the puppets had to get shot. So we had to make a puppet that was a trick puppet that you could wash its face and look normal, and then the next day, blood would just shoot out of its forehead at the audience. And then make sure that it was okay the next day. So we had puppets like that. There was a whole sequence of black and white puppets that got killed in different ways. Like one of them was an alien chest
So it's like the puppets themselves are the color of the flashback.
Yeah, they were black and white puppets, and we had a black and white background.
Yeah.
And so it was a flashback told that way. And then, the only thing that was in color was, of course, the red of them dying. And then somebody would walk out and pick a puppet up and be like, and that's what really happened. But 40 puppets, that was a big show.
Before I let you go, though, I know it's a hard time for performers of all stripes, but especially theater performers. How is that, and what can people do to make sure that they can even virtually participate in your upcoming season at the Puppet Co?
I will say performers have absolutely been struggling. COVID shut down everything that we as a community had to offer. I know so many people who lost so much money and income and gigs this year. It's not even, and I know it's global. I know that it's everybody everywhere, but it's an industry that won't come back first. We were the first to shut down, and we will be the first to open. And it's because our theater in particular does a lot of children's theater. So children not being able to be vaccinated means we can't open as soon as like big theaters like the Kennedy Center. We have to take that into consideration.
That's true.
Some theaters are able right now to open at 25% capacity. If we open at 25% capacity, we don't cover the bills for the day. So grants, I'm really excited and thankful that there are so many programs that exist where we can get grants, where we can get some funding, where we've been able to keep the lights on in a proverbial sense. But what I would really recommend, if this is of any interest to anybody, find your local theater groups, ask if they're accepting donations, find out how you can donate to them. Are they doing any online programming? Are they on social media? If they're on social media, give them a like, give them a boost. It helps people find their page. We do free puppet showings every Friday at 10:30. They're all the shows that we pre-recorded before the pandemic. We're offering them for free so that people have something to do with their kids. And we've been pretty consistent. There's only been a couple of weeks where somebody forgot that it was Friday, with me, and didn't post a video. But for the whole week, you can watch one of these, pre-recorded shows. And it's just word of mouth. When we can open, we want people to come back. We don't want people to be afraid. We're trying to take all the precautions possible, but we want people to know we still exist And I think that's important on a global level. Find those little communities, support those little communities. A lot of puppeteers wear a lot of hats. I'm the artistic director, but I'm also a puppeteer, and I'm also the director, and I'm also the editor currently, and I'm also the filmographer currently, and I'm also the sound editor currently, and I'm also the building manager currently. So that's not unusual in puppetry. Lots of people do a lot of roles. So, find those communities, support those communities, and when people are able to reopen, give them your support if you can. I know everybody's hurting, and it's been a weird, weird year, but that's the best way that you can help these artists make it through.
Elizabeth Dapo, thank you so much for coming on, and maybe someday we will be able to pressure institutions to care about the theater like they care about sports, and then there'll be some real investment in the thing we care about.
I hope so. Yep, that would be fantastic.
Thanks so much. See ya.
Thank you. Bye.
Oh, hey. Oh, y'all are still here. Thanks for sticking around till the end of the show. This was the end of the second one, and we're really glad that you're here. And we hope you'll even consider maybe supporting us. If you go to fans.fm/committee, there's several different tiers and some content you can access, like to this rock opera we're working on, based on Simone Weil's book, The Abolition of All Political Parties. Was thinking a lot about that book today, hearing about labor's troubles in the UK. And you know what? What would be a good sign-off this week would be for us to open up the big book of readings and pop it out. Yeah, for a prop book, this isn't working that well. Here we go. All right. On the Abolition of All Political Parties, 1957, Simone Weil. And this, of course, is from the introduction. To assess political parties according to the criteria of truth, justice, and the public interest, let us first identify their essential characteristics. There are 3 of these. 1, a political party is a machine to generate collective passions. 2, a political party is an organization designed to exert collective pressure upon the minds of all its individual members. 3, the first objective and also the ultimate goal of any political party is its own growth without limit. Because of these 3 characteristics, every party is totalitarian, potentially and by aspiration. If one party is not actually totalitarian, it is simply because it is surrounded by parties that are no less so. These 3 characteristics are factual truths, evident to anyone who has ever had anything to do with the everyday activities of political parties. As to the third, it is a particular instance of the phenomenon which always occurs whenever thinking individuals are dominated by a collective structure, a reversal of the relation between ends and means. Everywhere, and without exception, all the things that are generally considered ends are in fact by nature, by essence, and in a most obvious way mere means. One could cite countless examples of this, from every area of life: money, power, the state, national pride, economic production, universities, etc., etc. Goodness alone is an end. Whatever belongs to the domain of facts pertains to the category of means. Collective thinking, however, cannot rise above the factual realm. It is an animal form of thinking. Its dim perception of goodness merely enables it to mistake this or that means for an absolute good. The same applies to political parties in principle. A party is an instrument to serve certain conceptions of the public interest. This is true for parties which represent the instance of one particular social group, for there is always a certain conception of the public interest according to which public interest and these particular interests should coincide. Yet this conception is vague. This is true without exception and quite uniformly. Parties that are loosely structured and parties that are strictly organized are equally vague as regards doctrine. No man, even if he had conducted advanced research in political studies, would ever be able to provide a clear and precise description of the doctrine of any party, including should he himself belong to one of his own. People are generally reluctant to acknowledge such a thing. If they were to confess it, they would naively be inclined to attribute their incapacity to their own intellectual limitations, whereas, in fact, the very phrase, a political party's doctrine, cannot have any meaning. An individual, even if he spends his life writing and pondering problems of ideas, only rarely elaborates a doctrine. A group of people can never do so. A doctrine cannot be a collective product. One can speak, it is true, of the Christian doctrine, Hindu doctrine, Pythagorean doctrine, etc. But then what is meant by the word is neither individual nor collective. It refers to something that is infinitely higher than these two realms. It is pure and simply the truth. The goal of a political party is something vague and unreal. If it were real, it would demand a great effort of attention, for the mind does not easily encompass the concept of public interest. Conversely, the existence of party is something concrete and obvious. It is perceived without any effort. Therefore, unavoidably, the party, in fact, becomes its own end. You know, I'm not actually an anarchist myself, but I do see what she is saying, and one can almost imagine Simone being on the receiving end of many of the emails that we were getting during the Georgia election and having these dystopian thoughts towards all political parties. But I'm not a member of any political party. And I do really, when I think about a lot of the center-left troubles across the world, think about what she's talking about, this need for growth rather than for doctrine, as being a real problem and as being something that really needs to be addressed, because simply the mindlessness of having a team and growth and sort of gamifying and sports does seem to be a means without an end. And if you want an example, I've worked at the Democratic Party for almost 20 years. That number might not be right. Forrest, can you check that number right? It's been more than 10, less than 20, something in between there. Worked at the Democratic Party, and in all that time, no one's ever asked me why I'm not a member of the party and what it would take for me to join. And to sort of not be interested to that extent, to me, speaks volumes about something that is not an individual problem, but a systemic behavioral impulse. Good night, friends. Be well. See you next time.